Now, I've known N8n is pretty cool for a while, but as soon as I started self-hosting it, I saw the light. This thing is amazing, and I want to show you why. A lot of software that's out there can be really tricky to get self-hosted and might be more trouble than it's worth. N8n is not like that. It's really well suited for self-hosting. In fact, they have a lot of documentation on how you can improve how you self-host it. I think a big reason for that is because big organizations use N8n and they want more people to learn and understand it. Self-hosting is a great way to do that. Now, the other part about self-hosting is the fact that we did partner with Hostinger, and they have a one-click install. It's a very easy process to just get this up and going, and you can bring in your own custom domain name. I'm going to show you how to do all of that. So feel free to jump around to the sections you feel most comfortable with, and then just go from there and just kind of stick with me. If you get stuck, go back, watch some more, talk to ChatGPT, get these things solved, because once you start automating stuff, I don't think you'll ever go back. And a lot of you might be developers that want to go to the more advanced section so you can do even better automations, which of course I would hope everyone would work that direction, regardless of how technical you are right now, because N8n might get you hooked and you might want to do that much more. Let's take a look at the demo right now. This right here is an example of an N8n workflow that really sold me on it. So the idea here is this is a very simple automation. It's actually not really that flashy, but it is incredibly effective. So the idea here is I can schedule this workflow to run when I want it to. And of course, in this case, a workflow is just a series of steps that do something in the term of software, of course. But the thing here is we see that it actually will get something via Python, which is not very clear as to what's going on here. And of course, if you've used N8n other than self-hosted, you might be like, how do you do something via Python? I'm going to show you that in just a moment with the demo. And then we actually send a message through Gmail. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, the idea of logging in your Gmail account with another service grants that service access to your Gmail account, which may be what you want to have happen. It might not be. It's completely up to you. But I will show you in the more beginner section of how to actually set up something called the Google Auth platform, and more specifically, actual clients here. So not only can you send email messages, but you will also be able to send out stuff like getting your auto draft going, where you get an email coming in and you automatically get a draft to send it out. And of course, you can run this all of the time on every single email that you ever get. Now, there's other ones in here as well where we actually drop it into Google Spreadsheets. So you can actually drop things into Google Spreadsheets and work with that as well. Now, those two automations alone, I think, are worth learning. So you can use it in your own self-hosted N8n, or you can use it in other places as well. So the idea here, though, is to really have the processes that you use on a regular basis start becoming automated. To me, a lot of that is the foundation for using AI tools to make it a lot fancier, flashier, and maybe even that much more effective. But having the automations in place will really well position you to be able to do this. And I think controlling the actual server that runs all this is a huge benefit to doing that. Also controlling the actual apps that we authorize. So if it's not that clear, right here is my sign in with Google. I actually control the sign in with Google, and I can delete it at any time. I can also make sure that only I have access to my own data. Now, this would be true across your organization as well, and it is a nice thing that you get some granular, control over what's going on with your environment. Now, another aspect of this little daily, system status, this is where we go to the little bit more advanced stuff later in the course. This is the advanced customizations that you can do within N8n. What we do is we actually go in to our host, our server, our self-hosted server that we end up using, and we modify the Dockerfile. Now, this means that I can actually bring in Python scripts. I can bring in specific Python packages. I can also update NPM, which is what the N8n runs off of. It runs off of Node.js. It uses a lot of JavaScript in it. But of course, if you're not technical or you aren't a full-on developer, then you don't really need to worry about that. It's a lot of drag and drop, as I can show you too. But the idea here is I can customize everything that's going on in this runtime. For those of you who are curious about N8n and you haven't done it yet, this might be the reason. especially because on my channel, I've talked a lot about Docker, Docker files and all that. This gives you so much flexibility over any environment, including N8n. And then of course, here's our Docker Compose that runs it all. Now, this stuff is managed for us. You won't have to remember any of these things. I'm going to show you why in just a moment, and also of course in the course itself. But the idea here is we can create our own environment that runs N8n, and then I also can add in my own Python scripts in here. That's what's going on here. So I've got a hello world print statement, and then I've got this sys update here. This right here is all of that email that I showed you before. So it's quite literally getting all this email out, and then it's going to go ahead and print it out as a little piece. So right here, I've got this Python command that just calls that script, and then the next one just renames the output from that script. And then we grab our data about our own user's email, basically. So it's going to come in here. There's our user's email. And then I can send a message. What you see on any one of these nodes is we can actually move things around a lot, right? So let's go into this send message. I'm just going to show you how simple this is. So I've got a message down here. If that's not clear, it says message. I could go ahead and get this fixed. When you first drag it in, this is what it looks like. It'll just have an empty message, and you need to put a message in here. So you could obviously write some message here. You could put in just raw text, or you can have it as a result of your automations. And literally every single node or every single piece of the automation, you can unpack and use the data from that, right? And that part is what's so cool. So in the case of this Python command, I've got this std out here that I can use, or standard out. I can grab that data, or I can go to the rename output fields and I can bring this one in, just drag it on over. You can see that my sum message is still there, so I can go ahead and get rid of that. Now, if you know how to decode templating engines in coding, you can see this and be like, oh yeah, that's fairly straightforward. If you don't, all you see is some green lighting here that's showing us that, hey, this is going to be replaced. You can see what it's going to replace with. But the other thing is, if you did it incorrectly, it'll be red. Cool. And also you won't be able to execute the step because it's broken, right? This is of course very common in software development, but it's really good for non-developers, right? It's really good to just solve some little issues in here, and then you can send those messages, and you can send it as much as you want. A big part of the reason you can send it as much as you want is because it's your email address that you're actually sending from. And that is how it works. It's just you log into your email address and then it sends. And of course, you're not sharing passwords anywhere. You're just working off of what comes out of the box with N8n. It is a really fantastic tool, and hopefully some of those things highlighted as to why you want to host it yourself. But one of the biggest ones is controlling cost. You can know exactly how much of a server you are paying for and then run it based on those parameters. And you can run as many workflows as you might need, right? All of these workflows, you can have thousands probably on a server that you control, especially if it's big enough. And then you will be able to run these automations at will. The other thing is you can do this for other people. I think we're going to get into a phase where some people want very specific data about their job or what they're working on, and that automation, one single automation for that one single person, is going to be a huge unlock and will probably save hours and hours, maybe even more, on every week or every task that they're working on, which I think is also very cool. So what you do here is you build this fundamental skill set of using N8n, and then for those of you who want to go a little bit further, I'll show you how to customize it as well. So really a lot of this is getting your foundation down, using this tool because it's fantastic with automation. I did partner with Hostinger on this course. They came up with this idea for a course, and I am so hooked. I'm really excited to do a lot more with N8n and automations, and ideally Hostinger as well. So thanks so much for watching. Let's jump in right now. This might be the simplest workflow you'll ever create in N8n, but it will give you foundation on things you might want to do later, or at least it does for me. So the idea here is we are obviously sending what? An email. It says it very clearly in this node right here. It says send email. Now I do have some notes here that we'll talk about in a little bit. I also have this other node that says craft message. And then of course this very first one when clicking execute workflow. We'll talk about all of these pieces soon enough, but until we do, what I want to run here is hit execute workflow, and then I'm going to open up the email address that's coming to, and here we go. We get this email that says welcome to N8n with some message in here. Now right off the bat, I already see something I probably don't want to have in my emails, and that is this was automatically sent by N8n. So naturally what you're going to do then is you're going to go back to the workflow to figure out how to solve it, how to fix it. Now I'm going to give you the fix right now. It's as simple as jumping into this node right here, scrolling on down to the bottom where it says add option, clicking the append N8n attribution. Before I click that, you can see there's other items in the drop-down that might be really useful for you in the future as well, such as attachments, like a file attachment. I'm going to go ahead and append N8n attribution. I notice that it's already selected. I'm going to deselect it. So it's now off. I'm going to go ahead and run that workflow again. And so what I should get in my actual inbox is another message here. I'm going to click on it. And what I will see here is once again, that same message, but nothing else in there. So I want to show you how to build all of this step by step. There are some things about it that can get sort of complicated, but the point here is we want to start with the absolute basics of a workflow and start using third-party services to actually do the things we want it to do. In this case, the third-party service is an email service. This email happens to be Gmail, but the way I'm sending this email is through a process called SMTP. If you're familiar with like Apple Mail or Microsoft Outlook, that uses SMTP as well to send messages from those programs. So it's basically doing something that's tried and true and it's been around for a long time. In other words, you can use other kinds of email addresses for this part right here. I'm going to show you how to set it up with Gmail, but the process is similar in other places with some security caveats that we'll talk about in a little bit. But the idea here is when you go to start building out these workflows, you're going to inevitably jump into what happens next. All of these different things are available to you. So some of you might be like, oh, I'm going to go ahead and start using Gmail right away, which is great. If you are going to be using Gmail right away, you'll probably need to be on a cloud service. I'm not on that right now, but I will be later in this course. For now, we're going to be just showing you little by little that you can use in pretty much any workflow that don't really require a lot of those third-party service logins. We'll discuss that as we get a little bit more advanced. For now, what I'm going to be doing is showing you how to just build out this workflow from scratch. If this is your first time using N8n, I'm going to recommend you don't set up anything yet. Instead, you just watch a little bit of what I do to help you get a sense as to what you're getting into prior to going much further. Now, that last part might have shown you that, but this part is going to show you the nitty-gritty, the details on your first ever workflow that you might want to come back to from time to time because of how practical it is. Now, if you know what Docker is other than pants, as in the Docker software, you can go ahead and use the Docker Compose and have it run on your local machine. Now, the reason in the long run I don't recommend running it on your local machine is how it accesses third-party tools. Unless you're a lot more advanced and you know how to do something called tunneling, then you're definitely not going to want to go that route. You're going to want to use a cloud version of some kind, which I'll show you how to set up as well. But before we get to that far, what I want to show you is the simple way to build a workflow. When you first log into N8n, you're going to see something exactly like this. And naturally, you're going to start with creating a workflow. And this, of course, is the workflow like graph, the chart. So what you have here is this plus sign, which is very consistent with the plus sign over here, right? So if I click on that plus sign, what do you know? It opens that up. If I click on it here, it also opens that up. And if I use the tab button on my keyboard, it will toggle it open. That's pretty nice. So the idea here is we want to start somewhere. When it comes to N8n, we start with something called a trigger, something that kicks off our workflow. So what is that trigger going to be? Well, we have a lot of different options for triggers. So what I want to do though is just the simplest one, which is really trigger manually. Notice that it actually starts with what triggers this workflow, which is really nice. It gives us a lot of different options right out of the gates. Some of these options are a lot easier to implement once you go into the cloud hosting that we will do later, like something like an on webhook call, for example. But we're going to go ahead and trigger this manually, just like I did in the last one. Basically, whenever I want to run this, I just hit execute workflow and it runs. So right now, this is a very simple workflow that does nothing. It runs, but it really doesn't do anything. So then the next question, of course, is what is it that we're trying to do? What's the end result that we want to have? And that is to send email. So if I type out send or if I type out email, I will see a bunch of different options for email. Notice I see this thing called an email trigger. Remember, what is a trigger? A trigger starts the workflow. So that's actually pretty cool. There's this thing called IMAP. More on this in a minute. But the idea here is we've got the send email. We already saw that one before, but there are other options. And I wouldn't be surprised if there ends up being even more options in the future as well. But the thing is, a lot of email services will use the SMTP version of email. So if we do SMTP, I think I even get the send email. The only one that does SMTP is this one right here. So if I were to click on that, I see that I have two actions in here. So what's cool is I can do send message and wait for response. That's a little bit more advanced than where we need to go right now. But rather, we want to go ahead and send an email. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And this is now our parameters to send an email. So these parameters I can put in manually, absolutely. So like our from email, what's that from email going to be? Well, in my case, I'm going to go ahead and use just automate co@gmail.com. And I'm going to send it to another one called hungrypie@gmail.com. Now these emails are real email addresses and they are both mine. I use them when I'm learning and doing and sharing things like this. So that means that I may or may not check these ones. The just automate one, I will maybe put into a bunch of automations at some point in some sort of course, like I'm doing right now. But the idea here is we're going to go ahead and say hello world, and then that will be our subject, which you're probably already very familiar with. And then you got this email format. This is something maybe you're brand new to. What is HTML? What is text email? Now, HTML gives you images and colors and all sorts of things that like a promotional email might have that you might be already familiar with. Text, on the other hand, is just going to be plain text, like you're text messaging someone, and you can go ahead and say, hello there, this is a test, ! And then we'll go ahead and say best and whatever your name is. And my name is Justin. Okay, so the idea here is one of the things that you won't have yet is this SMTP account. So I'm going to go ahead and save this workflow as is. You want to get in the habit of saving these things, and notice that it's called my workflow. I want to go back into my personal account, and I'm going to go into credentials here, and I'm going to go ahead and delete this one that I already have. So the reason I'm deleting that one is to show you how to set this up. So we're going to go ahead and add our first credential. Now, there's a lot of options here, so it's really tricky to always know exactly what it is that we're doing. This is where a lot of times in our workflows, the tool itself or the node itself will help us with this process. So if I open this node back up, I can now see it says connect or credential to connect with, which is what you would have seen in yours if you were following along, or whenever you come back to this, you can see it says create new credential. This is great. This is really shortcuts how I need to set up my credentials. And so the question, of course, is what's our user? Again, this is an SMTP account. So our user is going to be our email address. Now, some SMTP servers don't use your email address. So you're going to have to look at the documentation for that or ask whoever's in IT that's helping you with this part, right? So in my case, since I'm using Gmail, I can use just automate co@gmail.com. Then I need to pick the password, which we'll do in a second. Then my host is smtp.gmail.com. This is always the host for Gmail. And then everything else I don't really need to do other than the password itself. So where do I get my password? Well, you probably know your Google account password, right? So like you could type that in here, but unfortunately and fortunately, that doesn't work. Unfortunately, it doesn't work because, well, it would be really convenient if it did. Fortunately, it's really insecure to just give out your password everywhere. So what Google made was something called app passwords. So if you search myaccount.google.com/app passwords, exactly like that, then you'll be able to open this up. Also in your account, if you just search for app passwords, you could do that as well. So if you open up your Google account and searched app passwords here, this will also allow for you to do that, which is this right here. And that, of course, opens up that same screen that I just did, but of course it's going to ask you to confirm you are who you are, which I just confirmed off the video. So you see that in my app passwords, I have this other one called N8npw, which I'm going to go ahead and delete. And then I'll create another one called N8npw. We'll hit create. This does this. Now, if you're familiar with security, hopefully some of you are, the idea is you probably don't want to share this with anybody, but you're seeing mine right now. That's okay, because what I can do is delete it in just a moment, which is exactly what I'll end up doing, right? So you can create these and delete them at any time, and they're made specifically so we can actually use them in things like this. So what we're going to do then is jump back into N8n, paste in that app password there, hit save, and then we've got our credentials in here. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be fully working. I think it does do the connection test, which of course you could just retry and see if that ends up working. It seems like it's okay. But the real test will be coming from when you actually go to send the email, which you could just test right here with executing the step. And in which case it's sent an email to that email address, and I could double check that again. And going back in here, there's my hello world. And once again, it's showing up. So we now have our very simple workflow working. But there's of course one thing that I still want to improve on is how do I actually take these items and put them as part of the workflow? Let's see how to do that right now. We're now going to modify the send email node so that it actually has the subject based off of another piece of the workflow. So to do this, we go back into the workflow and then we just hit this plus icon that's in between the start and the send email. In other words, it's going to happen before the send email. So we want to go ahead and hit plus here, and we're going to go ahead and put something in. Now it's really easy to accidentally remove these lines by hitting the trash can, in which case this send email no longer works. So you want to make sure that these are connected, and sometimes you'll get it to the point where it might feel like they're connected, but they're actually not. Like if it's positioned like that, that certainly looks connected, but when I go to execute it, it doesn't actually run it. So you'll just want to be aware of that fact that you want them connected if you want them to run. So let's go ahead and hit this plus icon here, and I'm going to go ahead and type out code, and then I'm going to go ahead and paste code in JavaScript. So here we go, code in JavaScript right here. So the reason we use JavaScript in this case is it will give us some flexibility we'll see later, but for now I'm going to go ahead and just type out return, put these two curly brackets in there, and then I'm going to hit enter under there, and I'm just going to go ahead and do subject colon, and I'll go ahead and say this is my code subject. And then I'll go ahead and execute this step, in which case everything should work just okay. Now, for those of you who aren't really that familiar with coding or using code, a big part of the reason I'm introducing this now is because AI tools exist. So let's say, for instance, you're using Claude. I'm going to go ahead and copy this right here. And let's go ahead and paste this in. And I'll say, I am using code in JavaScript, node in N8n. Quite literally saying exactly what I'm doing, code in JavaScript. Here's that node, all that sort of stuff. Modify the, oh wait, let's make sure it's in here. I'm gonna go ahead and say modify the above data to include the date of today every time this runs. Make sure the date is auto set. Hit enter, and then I run this. Okay. So you'll get better at prompting and all of that, but the idea here is I now have this date in here. And so it's giving me a bunch of different options in here. And I want to just change it a little bit and say, I want the date in the subject. It's kind of hard to know if this is the case, but I'll show you how to test it in just a moment. But here we go. Okay, so it's basically the same thing I did. I'm going to go ahead and hit copy here, and I will bring that into my code in JavaScript node here, and I will paste it in. Okay, great. So we'll come back to this in just a moment, but if I hit execute step now, I can see there it is. It's showing the date in there, right? So today is something like that, execute step, there we go. We now have a different subject that we could potentially use. Now hitting execute step is important for going to the next part, which is going back into this node here. And now I want to replace this subject with what just happened, okay? So here we go. We've got the schema inputs. We've got other inputs. So the other nodes are now available as context for this email. In other words, I could just grab this and drag it on over in here. And there we go. We've got hello world JSON.subject. But notice the result in here is showing the result from that code that we just changed, which is pretty cool. So if I get rid of this hello world, it just will simply be that right there. And in which case I can always execute the step again, and then I can jump back into my email address. And what I see is that coming through. So that's it. So that's a big part of the reason why I use this code right out of the gates. Now, I realize that N8n can be a very powerful no-code tool whatsoever, but the point here is that we now have something that's powerful as well, is we can add in different items in here, saying something like, this is my message to you, right? And so now I've got that again. I'm not going to execute the step yet. Instead, I'm going to go back into send email, and notice that since the step was not executed, I don't have that message in there, which means that I need to execute everything from before, which I can do by coming in here, of course, or I can go right above it and hit play, and in which case it should execute up to that point as well. Then going back into the send email, that block is now there. I can drag that on over, and we have it down here towards the end. So I'm going to go ahead and change that again. I'll remove everything out of here, then drag it on over, and there we go. So it's showing me exactly what needs to happen with this. Granted, you can learn how all of this stuff works, but then I'm going to go ahead and hit send. And now, of course, in my email, I get this message. This is my message to you. Fantastic. So I now have a much better block in here altogether, thanks to this just little code block in here. And of course, you could always go back into Claude and use some of the other things that are available. So I did say I will come back to some of these. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this instead, right? I'll leave that message in there, so it's going to be a little bit wonky, but basically I want to get rid of that right there, and then just make sure there's a comma right there. Okay, feel free to use Claude to format that as you'd like, but I'm going to go ahead and execute this step, and I can see the date here. It's a little bit different of a date now. So I'm going to go back into my send email, and I see I've got my subject is still in there, so I don't necessarily have to bring that over again, unless I wanted to duplicate it. But now I can do a tab, or a dash rather, and then I can bring that date in now, and there we go. So now we have the ability to have that whole thing as my string or for my subject, in which case we can now go back into our email, and there is a much more advanced email than it was prior, thanks to just using Claude in addition to, actually what N8n does really, really well. So this is something you're going to want to get in the habit of doing. Using that code block, I think, is a huge unlock for everything else. Because every once in a while, you'll run into a situation like what I did with that timestamp, that maybe there's a node that already exists for it, maybe not. That's why I really like using the code part of this, which is a really, really nice feature that N8n has out of the box. Every once in a while, you'll open up your workflow and you'll click on a node, and you'll notice that there is no input data yet. This means that you want to execute the previous nodes. You click that button, it will run the rest of the workflow up until this point. It won't execute this workflow, but it will run all the others. Now, the other thing about this is you see that there's different data types in here. There's a schema one, a table one, and a JSON one. All of these you can use inside of this particular node, and you can really just see what's coming through on each piece of the workflow, each node in the workflow. So this means that maybe I want to add in another node in here. So let's say, for instance, we've got our from email and our to email. Well, maybe I want to have those as constant values in here. Now, on one hand, you might think, oh, I can just open up the variables tab, but then I come to find it's only available on the enterprise plan. So I can't use variables. Well, maybe not across workflows so much, but inside of a workflow, this process is fairly straightforward. All I need to do here is open up a new code block, and I can just consider this as my constants, right? And in which case I would come in here and again return back what's called an object or a dictionary here, where on one side you would put the key value, let's say for instance our to email, and in this case it'll be hungrypie@gmail.com, and then our from email, and that was just automateco@gmail.com. Right, so now we've got these constants that I can use in other places. So I went ahead and ran this, and I see my output here, which I can look at the schema in JSON. I can look at all of the same sort of stuff. This output, of course, gets fed into the next value, which eventually gets fed into send email. But let's say, for instance, I accidentally reorganize these a different way. Let's say, for instance, I put the code in JavaScript here, which is going to be a different name in just a moment. But let's go ahead and now add them in. I'll go ahead and connect those, and then connect that one here. And for some reason it's not. There we go. And so now jumping into send email again, what of course I need is all of these different values. So let's go ahead and execute the previous nodes in here like it told me to. And so now I get these red, icons in here. So what's going on? They were working just a moment ago, but now they're not working. Well, the reason they're not working like they once were is because of the ordering here. I switched up the order, so this node right here has different things coming into it. So that's where using this schema becomes very, very valuable, in which case you would then go into where that was originally. So it's basically going to replace this one. I'm going to delete that, and then I'll go ahead and drag this one in right here and paste it in. So now I see a much different expression. So what it shows me is the name of the node, .item.json.subject. So luckily for us, N8n is going to help fill that in. But of course, so you can still run into errors here. So we'll see what those are in just a moment. But now, of course, I can bring in the date like that, and then I can bring in that message again. Let's go ahead and do that with the message right here. And then finally, what I can do is the from email and to email, which come directly from the previous one, which is now the constants one in here. So to email now. I'll go ahead and replace hungry pie in here with that to email. Notice it's back to that $JSON in here. And then I can go ahead and grab the from email in here. And then sure enough, this will work really well for us now. And I can hit execute step, and it will run that email and send it out to us, which of course you could verify with all the different emails I've been sending. But the idea here is we now have a workflow that moves around a lot, and it has some constants in here as well. So I mixed up the workflow on purpose to show you how this data flows and the fact that you can access different pieces of the data without really passing it around. So in the case of our send email, the input that's going to come in is only from constants, right? So this JSON thing right here is only going based off of the input that was passed into this one right here. Whereas the other ones is now referencing a completely different node. So let me actually show you this exact same thing by passing the data through, and basically you don't want to do this. So when it comes to the code in JavaScript here, I've got all of this stuff. I hit execute step, it brings it into the message. Here's the output. That output gets fed into the next node. In there, I can actually use those same values. So let's say, for instance, I want to bring in subject. That would mean I would just drag this subject over like that. Pretty cool that it auto fills it for me. I can bring in the date and just do it like that. And then I can bring in the message as well, and like this. So I'm really just passing the data through. I'm not changing it at all. I'm just passing it through. I hit execute step. I see that my output is now sort of enriched with some new data. Sometimes it makes sense to do this, but right now I don't think it does. I think we're doing something that's a little redundant. But that means that our send email will at least be a little bit more simple. What I can do then is I can obviously change the subject now to being the subject from our input here. I can bring this subject in now, and then do a dash, and then bring in this date in. And it's essentially the same as what we just saw. But of course, things can break, and there's all sorts of issues that could happen. But the thing is, you don't need to do this because we can reference other pieces. That's really the point that I wanted to get across right here, is you can always reference something else. And when you do reference something else, the nice thing about it is in the future, if you move it around and you don't change the name at all, it will still be referenceable. So let's go ahead and see what I mean by that. If I come in here and bring another code element, I realize I'm doing all these code elements, but a big part of it is to just basically say, I'm going to go ahead and change something. Let's go ahead and say new message, or MSG being hello world, and I'll put it into actual JavaScript a little bit more. So new MSG here, and then I'll hit execute step. This step right here has now broken my send email. If I open this up, all of those inputs are now completely gone, except the ones where I referenced the actual location. Those are still there and they're still working because the inputs changed. So it's just a slight little thing that you need to be aware of as you start building these things out a lot more, because it's really easy to get this part incorrect. Using those code blocks just made it a little bit easier to highlight where these things can go wrong. Another thing that can go wrong is by changing the name of the node itself. So let's say, for instance, we'll call this something like format message, and this actually makes a lot more sense of a title for our node, formatting that message. And this could be something else that we might want to change as well. Maybe we don't call it constants anymore. Maybe we want to call this something more like our default to and from data, or from data. In which case I also want to get rid of the subject, date, and message in there. And now I've got, I send email here. Hey, what do you know? It actually updated it for me. I didn't actually have to do anything there. That was super nice. Whereas up here, it's still doing the input one, which might work just fine. It's going to be completely up to you. But the point is that we have a way to be able to move these things around. And as you move them around, the inputs start to get a little bit trickier to work with, to actually use, which is an important part. A lot of times when you have a workflow, you want to make sure that you can stop it in its tracks if it's not doing something you want it to. In the case of sending an email, for example, maybe we only want specific domain names to be able to send an email. So if we're sending an email to @Gmail, that's okay. Everything else, not okay. Or you can replace @Gmail to being our own email addresses with our own custom domain name. So this is called a condition, which is a form of control flow. This is a software programming thing, but if we go ahead and hit plus here and type out if, hopefully you understand if this, then that. That's kind of the idea here, is we're going to go ahead and put in this if statement in here, and we want it to be some sort of conditions. Now, we can actually have a lot of conditions in here, and how it works is pretty cool. So I'm going to show you how it works at a basic level. So the idea here is these conditions, we want it, if it's true, then we'll send the email. If it's false, we won't send the email. That's kind of the idea. So I'm going to go ahead and move this over, and then I'll go ahead and bring this connection in. We won't send email yet, but we will soon. Okay, so going back into the data that feeds into that condition, we've got a to and from email. So going into the condition now, we can see that that data is coming through, and now I can use it for my condition, right? So I can grab this to email here, and I can literally say it is equal to hungrypie@gmail.com, in which case if I execute this step, it will say the true branch has that data, the false branch has nothing. And if I look in the actual workflow itself, we can see the true branch is now green and the false one is gray. So if I were to change the data itself and execute the step again, now it's the opposite, false and true. So this gives me the ability to say, hey, oh, if it's true, then yeah, actually send that email. If it's false, then don't. So the example that I mentioned before was like maybe the domain name, for example. So how would we do that? Well, in the case of these conditions, it's really cool. It has this little is equal to. If I click down on it, I actually see a bunch of data types. Now, you might not be familiar with what a data type is. I'll explain this a little bit by looking at the code in a moment. But of course, this is a string itself. And we know this because when we created this data, there was quotes around it. But also we know this because inside of N8n, it already did a bold to a string. In other words, it didn't do a number and say it's equal to some number. It literally started with a string. So N8n already understands these data types really well, which makes it a lot easier for us to design it. So in other words, I can grab this drop down here, go to string, and then scroll all the way down to ends with. And then this is where I can now say, oh, does it end with @gmail.com? I can hit true, and what do you know? It does. So then it runs that branch, which probably would end up sending the email as well. Again, I'm going to go ahead and take that off, execute the workflow. We can see that it goes in there, and that works. So when it comes to the data types themselves, we would actually have to go back into here and basically try out other data types. So for example, my number, and literally typing out a number, and then my Boolean, which is like a true false, we type out true or we type out false. Now the auto code will show me that. If I did false, it kind of underlines it like that, where it's saying, hey, that's not a valid expression at all. So these give me my number, my Boolean, and there are other data types, but these are kind of the main ones that you'll probably use a lot of. Now, the reason I put these quotes around here is this is called a string data type, right? So a number and then a Boolean. And it's important to know these things, but of course you could always look them up later of what a data type is. The idea being mostly that a lot of the content that you might be familiar with is strings. So whenever you're on a form and you're typing something out, it's going to be stored as a string. But when you're starting to work with databases and real like numbers, real stored data, then you start getting data types like my number, where it's an actual number and it's treated as such with math, which you could do something like, this times 10. This is a multiplication example, and it would actually quite literally multiply those values for you, which is more obvious when you put some random number in there, and there you go. But of course, if one of them was a string here with quotes around it, we get an error and it just simply won't work correctly. So that's kind of the point here, is numbers can actually be multiplied. Boolean values are for conditions as well. So we're basically doing the true or false right here, right? But now we can do it with those data types. So I can go ahead and add in a condition here and say my number, let's say for instance, it already starts at a number, and then we can say greater than or equal to, let's do, what was the number we put in here? That is a massive number. Let's say 1,000, right? I hit execute steps. This says false, okay? So we got something in here that's not actually 1,000 because, I changed it to 123. So let's go ahead and say it's greater than or equal to 100 now, execute that, now it runs. And then the final condition would be my Boolean value is, when I click on this drop down, it now gives me these options, and I can say is true, right? And then if I run this, now it's false, right? So all of these conditions are not met. And that's kind of the point. And so you have the ability to stack a bunch of different parameters to say, hey, do we want this to proceed to the next step? And the way I would think about this is basically like a Boolean value where, let's go ahead and put a comma at the end of that false there. And then you go ahead and say auto send enabled being true. And then maybe say like only Gmail being true or only internal. You could maybe rephrase it to only internal, right? And so then you would have this condition in here that can go on. And the other cool part about it is you can add other conditions. So you can bring in another one in here and attach it to that as well, to where then it can check a bunch of different conditions and do a bunch of different things. Now, of course, you can get really like over the top with these conditions. So I wouldn't recommend you put in too many up front, but rather just understand that you can now change the flow of things based off of what's going on prior. So going back in here, there's our value in here. I'll go ahead and say, we'll do, this is enabled now. I'll go ahead and leave auto send enabled. This will be our new condition, in which case I'll run this. We'll jump into if, and instead of it being my Boolean, I'll now say auto send enabled, in which case I can now execute that step. It does the true branch. And if I execute the entire workflow, it will send that workflow. Going back into that config, I can just quickly turn this off and then run that workflow again. This time it didn't send that message. It's pretty cool. So the nice thing about this too is once we actually implement the next part, which would be actually using Gmail, that would allow for us to do all sorts of interesting things with these workflows. We're now at a point in our workflow where we might want to do something more. For example, maybe we want to get a Google Sheet that has valid emails that we will auto send to. So what you would do then is you would open up the Nodes panel, you would do a quick search for Sheets, you'd bring in Google Sheets, and then you would say maybe like get rows in Sheet. And then as you start to configure this, you'll see that there's create new credential. You'll open that up and you'll see OAuth 2 in here. And also important, you'll see localhost in here. So if you see localhost in your OAuth redirect URL, that means you are working off of your local machine and it is not accessible to the public internet. That's really important for OAuth. OAuth usually needs something that's on the public internet to work correctly or to work really well. Now, if you're not familiar with OAuth, it is something you probably have used before, which is like when you're going to a website and you see this sign in with Google button and you select it on that website, it brings you over to Google, you log into Google, and then it brings you on back to that website. We have to do that same process with N8n so that we can use things like Google Sheets. We could also use other services that are similar to that. Let's say, for instance, Slack, for example. If you go into Slack and you try to do the same thing, you can see that in their credentials, there's another one for OAuth 2. Similar idea here, logging in with Slack. And of course, you could really experiment or navigate through all of the different ones that you might need in order to actually use them. Like the Gmail one, also very similar, OAuth 2, right? So the idea here is we need to have our actual N8n working on the public internet. We need it to be on the cloud. So we actually have two options for this. One is going to be self-hosting. The other one is going to be managed. We're going to be going the self-hosting route for many different reasons I'll get into soon. The short of it is we'll probably be able to run as many workflows as we want without bogging down our local machine because it'll be on a production grade server that we don't have to manage. It's actually really nice. That's a huge benefit. The other side of it is, since it will be on a public domain name, we will then be able to wrap in our OAuth apps and do so controlling the entire pipeline, which becomes a lot more clear once we actually do that, but it is a nice feature and a nice aspect of it, even if it takes a little bit more work to actually set up. But the point here is now we're ready to start that process, so let's take a look at the next section. We're now going to spin up the self-hosted version of N8n, and we're going to do so on the cloud. So of course what this means is we're going to be using the free version of N8n and running it on servers that we have control over. Now, a lot of times when you go to self-host something, it can take a lot of configuration on the server. In this case, it won't take a lot because we will be doing a one-click install and setup thanks to Hostinger. Now, I partnered with them on this series because it's really easy to do that one click. But what's also really easy is to go in there and modify it as you see fit. So for those of you who know how to do something called SSH, you will be able to modify your self-hosted instance to add things like Python into the runtime environment. Now, I'm going to show you how to do that when we get a little bit more advanced. But for those of us who just want the one-click install, we're going to go ahead and set up Hostinger right now. Head on over to hostinger.com/cfe10 for a massive discount. The idea here, though, is what you are picking is an actual server. So you're going to pick a virtual private server so you can run all sorts of code on here. It just doesn't have to be N8n itself. But the reason you might want to do the KVM2 is because you can run 1,000, maybe even 10,000 workflows in N8n on there. Now, I'm not sure if you'll ever get to the point where you need to run 10,000 workflows, but if you do, you will have more than enough power to make this happen. Now, the other side of this, especially if you go to the more advanced part of what I'm doing, you will also be able to run a lot more powerful automations in the background next to N8n using a server of this size. So I'm going to go ahead and select this plan. Now I'm going to select the period of 24 months. I'm not going to select daily auto backups. I'm pretty sure I could add this later, but weekly ones are included. And since I'm getting started right now, I'm totally okay with weekly ones. Next up, I'm going to select my server location that's near me. At this point, the Phoenix location is the one that's near me. And then I'm going to select my operating system, which of course is an application. As you can see here, you can install all sorts of other things in there. And there's some other N8n instances that maybe is worth checking out at some point, but I'm going to use the default one. Next up, what I'm going to do is go over to the order summary and make sure my coupon code of CFE 10 is applied. This just lets them know that, hey, we worked together on this one, and you get a little discount there as well. Let's go ahead and continue on. Then of course, we're going to register in here as your account. In this case, I'm using justautomateco@gmail, and then I'm going to go ahead and sign in here. And then I'll go ahead and start that process of completing the checkout once it's all loaded. Okay, I filled out all my information and I hit submit payment. We now want to secure access to our server. So we're going to create an admin password that of course you don't want to share with anybody to be able to access your server. Now, if you lose this password, it's totally okay. You can reset it inside of Hostinger in a little bit. And of course, if you're a little bit more advanced and you know what SSH keys are, you can always add a key right now. I also have a blog post on how to build out SSH keys. This works cross-platform, Mac, Linux, Windows. You can absolutely do that. Now, the cool thing about Hostinger is there's a way to generate passwords right here. Now, of course, if you don't want to do that, you can also use Chrome and do suggest password. There's a lot of different ways on how you can get these passwords up. The point here is you want to have a secure one, or as secure as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and use one of these in here. Then go ahead and I copied it. So I'm going to actually have it on my notes off the video. I'm going to go ahead and hit next now. And of course, this is going to finish off that creating. So in this, we've got a save password that comes up in your browser, which you might want to have. And I'll just go ahead and say root-vps1, like this is the first server I'm creating. That's why I'm calling it that. This might be a good thing that you want to do. Every once in a while, these kinds of password managers make these things convenient. But of course, security is always something you want to be aware of in that case. Next up, you can have the free malware scanner built in here. I'm going to go ahead and say yes. That's great that that's already in there, which is really nice. And then I'll finish the setup process. Now, this could take a few minutes to actually fully set up. Now, the reason for this is because what we're doing is we're getting a blank server, and this process is going to set up that server so that Docker is in there and working. Docker is then used to make sure that N8n is in there and working. And there's quite a few tools in there to make sure all of that ends up working in the way that it should, but then also allow us to have public access right out of the box. So we'll see that in a little bit. Now, the key thing about that root password is this is not your N8n password. It's just your password for your server. It's just one thing to keep in mind. And also the name of the user that you're going to have for that server is simply root, or, ROOT, root. That's going to be your default user when you set some of these things up. But at this point, I'm going to jump into manage VPS. And of course, you're going to see something that looks exactly like this. Feel free to skip this if you'd like. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'll let it sit for a few more minutes so I can see these stats for the server right on my Hostinger dashboard. We're now at a point where we want to bring in our own custom domain. Now, the reason we want to do this now is so that all of our configuration in the future will be based off of this custom domain. So if we ever use any sort of webhooks or we have callbacks for OAuth, we get our own custom domain. Now, this process could be really technical, but luckily for us, we can actually make the modifications directly in Hostinger itself. Let's take a look. When it comes to starting to automate things with N8n, I think having a custom domain name is an absolute must. This will become more and more clear as we use this domain name, but for now, we're going to go ahead and set it up. The process is fairly straightforward. You buy a domain name like mydomain.com from some place. I'll show you a few that I like, and then from there, you can actually point what's called an A record to the IP address of your actual server. All of this we're going to do right now. So I really like using Cloudflare. I use them for all sorts of things, and you can use them to purchase domain names for pretty inexpensive. Now, there are other ones that you could consider. GoDaddy has been around for a long time. There's another one called Namecheap that a lot of people like to use, and then I've used name.com as well. Now, the price of each domain name varies based off of a lot of factors, one of them being whether or not it's popular and whether or not it's the .com. You can kind of pick and choose how you see fit, but I'm going to be using Cloudflare in here. And of course, you can go into registering a new domain. And let's say, for instance, you want to do mycooldomain.com. You do a quick search for that, and you'll find some sort of domain name that's out there. And as you can see, they vary in prices all across the board. Here's a good one, mycooldomain.win. $4.18 per year, or well, it gets to being $5.18 per year. That's a pretty inexpensive domain name if you ask me. But in my case, I already own a domain name, so I'm just gonna click back on Cloudflare or my account home, and I'm gonna be using my hungrypie.com domain. Now, what's important to understand about your domains and the place that manages them is those can be separate. Like you can buy it in one place and manage it in another place. Now, I'm not going to go through that process, but what we need to do now is we need to manage our domain name by updating our DNS records. So if I select my domain name and look for DNS, I'm able to start adding in DNS records. you can do this same thing in name.com, Namecheap, GoDaddy, pretty much any place that you can buy a domain name, you can change the domain name records. You can also change something called name servers. When you change the name servers, that place is where you're going to manage the domain name then, right? So in this case, I've got my Cloudflare name servers here. I would need to manage them in Cloudflare, which you can do if you purchase your domain name on GoDaddy, for example. You can have it managed in Cloudflare as well. But again, that's sort of outside the scope of this one, but it's important to understand in case your domain name just not working with what we're about to do. So the point here is we want to add a new record, and it's going to be an A record. The reason it's an A record is because of the IP address. So jumping back into my actual Hostinger account, I have an IP address right here, right? So you can grab your IP address. This part is going to go then into what you're putting on Cloudflare itself. Okay, or whatever your domain name registrar is. This is the target. This is where it's pointing to. So sometimes what you'll see is a CNAME record. This is not a CNAME record. The target itself is not an IP address. This would be something else. This doesn't apply here. We use the A record and we use that IP address. In the case of Cloudflare, I'm turning the proxy off. You can configure the proxy for it to work in this system, but I'm not going to do that at this time. It's a little bit too technical to where we're at. I'm going to change my TTL, or time to live, to about 2 minutes, mostly so that in the future, if I want to change the DNS, I can. Also, if I want to change the subdomain, I can, and it will change really, really fast. In my case, I'm not going to call it N8n. I'm going to call it workflows. That's what I want to call it. I think this makes a whole lot of sense, but it will show me the 2 customizations that I'll need to do. So there we go. We've got a new domain name and a new subdomain for our N8n. I'm going to go ahead and save this. So of course, the big question now is, where do we actually configure this in Hostinger? So this is actually what's cool about Hostinger is you can go into the Docker manager. On one hand, if you know how to SSH and you know Docker, you'll just need to change the env file. If you don't know how to do that, you can just use Hostinger, go into this Docker manager here, click on edit. And what we want to look for is the YAML editor, or the .yaml editor, so we can see this environment file here. So what do you know? We've got a domain name in here and a subdomain. Remembering back, we used workflow as our domain name, or our subdomain rather. So workflows, oops, I had S there, so let's go ahead and make sure we do that. And then of course our domain name is that custom one that I have, which is in my case, hungrypie.com. I'm going to go ahead and hit deploy. This will now deploy those changes so that my server, or my domain name that's pointed to this IP address, actually works correctly. One of the things you want to avoid doing right now is going directly to that subdomain and domain name, because you want to wait a little bit for things to propagate. This might take 5 minutes, it might take a few hours. But the point here is you want to avoid running into issues with your domain names. If you weren't aware, this whole domain name thing needs to be updated around the world on how things are accessed. So this can take some time. It might be really fast. It might happen immediately. But that's part of the reason I have this TTL at 2 minutes, so that if I ever need to change this in any sort of form, I can. And that's the point. That's why you do these TTLs really, really short. But after you have it established for a long time, then you want to come back in here and you can change it to being up to a whole day. And so that means that all of the different services that might use this domain name can be aware of it. There's a lot of complicated stuff that goes into that. But the idea is we want to make sure that our subdomain and our IP address are pointing to the correct place for long enough before we ever even try to attempt to access it in the near future. As far as Hostinger is concerned, we don't necessarily need to update any sort of domain name in there, mostly because it's already running our N8n server. Yes, this manage app button won't necessarily work with our new server at this current configuration, but the thing is, you're going to want to make sure it's working before you change anything else in Hostinger, because really what you're going to do then is go to workflows.hungrypie, or of course whatever your domain name is, and hit enter. After a short amount of time, you'll start seeing this, and now we're ready to start configuring N8n. If you don't see this, if you see an error or a warning about being insecure or something like that, that means somewhere along the line you didn't configure things correctly. So you would want to check your IP address, and you want to make sure that that is in your actual A record for your domain. You're also going to want to make sure you're checking your subdomain. Both of those things are absolutely correct. And then of course, going back into that Docker manager, going into edit, and then going into the YAML version and just making sure that your environment has those same things in there exactly the way they should be. Those things are what are going to need to have happen. And then you might need to wait a little while before you finish the setup process. Now that we have N8n running on our own server, as well as our custom domain name, it's time to log in and set it up at least a little bit. The idea here is you need to create an owner account for N8n. This is specific to N8n. At this point, we have 3 new accounts. We have a hostinger account, we have a user account for the server itself, and then we have an N8n account. So in other words, this should be unique. The password here should be unique to those other things. So I'm going to go ahead and use justautomateco@gmail. I'm going to put my name and last name in here, and then I'm going to go ahead and suggest a strong password that it will give me. So in this case, I'm also going to go ahead and save this password into my Google account. I'll go ahead and hit next. And so what you're going to want to make sure is the username and password are saved. So the username is going to be your email, not your last name. Now, of course, you're seeing this is because I've tested this off the video, but the idea is you want to make sure you have the correct password in there. Next, you can absolutely fill out this questionnaire if you'd like. You don't need to. And you also don't need to get this license key. You totally can. I don't typically do it because a number of these things I don't particularly care to have. So I'm going to go ahead and hit skip here. So naturally, now we're in our own hosted instance of N8n. Now, before I actually build out a workflow, I want to show you one of the major reasons to use the self-hosted instance itself. And I'm going to go ahead and trigger a workflow manually. And then I'm going to go ahead and look for execute command. So this execute command, I can actually run on my local machine. So if I run, let's say, for instance, echo and hello world and hit execute step, what I see here is the actual std out, or really the terminal command for this. Now, if you're not familiar with terminal at all, especially if you're not familiar in the terms of like Linux, let's say, for instance, you are brand new to something like this. In the case of echo, this is a command I think that works on all systems. So if I said echo hello world here and hit enter, the response that comes back is the std out. So it's standard out is what that's called. So that's what's happening here is I now have access to run this terminal on my server. So it's actually happening on a layer that I can get into in more depth. But the idea here is it's on the server itself, but it's also inside of Docker. So there's multiple places where you can run things. In this case, it's running inside of a Docker container that's running on the server. That's for those of you who understand what I mean by that. If you don't, just understand that you can now execute commands on your server. I don't think this is available on the non-self-hosted version or the managed version, but it is available in self-hosted, which unlocks a lot of potential that we'll see as we go forward. But for now, that's it. That's all I really wanted to show you on the self-hosted. There's definitely a lot more to it than just that. This particular workflow I don't need, so I'm going to go ahead and archive it. Feel free to keep it if you'd like. But now what I want to do is basically recreate that last section, starting with IMAP and being able to auto send emails based off of what's coming in. Our very first workflow we're going to run is going to be an autoresponder from one email address to another using a mechanism called SMTP and IMAP. This mechanism works across all kinds of email hosts. In other words, not just Gmail. We will see a Gmail specific one soon enough, but of course I did something like this in the last section, but now I'm going to go a little bit slower to show you exactly what's going on with this. Now, of course, inside of N8n, you're going to go ahead and hit create workflow. The very first step to any workflow is a trigger. Like, what starts this workflow from going? A lot of times this is an event that happens elsewhere. Basically, a trigger is an event. So for example, you could have someone fill out an email interest form And when they hit submit, that could trigger a workflow. You could think about this for all sorts of things. Someone calls you, triggers a workflow. Someone sends you an email, triggers a workflow. Let's look at the email one. So what we want to do is add our first step. Now there's a couple different ways on how we can do this, which is one of the nice things about N8n. You can hit plus right here, and then we can see what triggers this workflow. You can also hit plus up here, and same thing. You can also hit tab, and that will toggle it for you as well. The idea though is we need to select a trigger. Now, triggering manually is a very straightforward process. It basically means that anytime you are inside of N8n, that's the only way that that workflow can run. On an app event, this is when third-party apps trigger workflows. We'll look at this later. On a schedule is really nice because your server will then run the workflow for you when it hits a certain time. So N8n and your server need to be working at the time in order for this to work. If you're familiar with a tool called cron, it's very similar to that, but basically it's on a schedule. You get a set when you want it to run. This is something that's very common for things that aren't necessarily responding to an event. So for example, if a sale is made and you don't have any integration on here to check that that sale was made, then you might want to run a schedule where it's checking sales for the past hour or the past day or whatever. That's kind of the idea. Now, going beyond that is a webhook call. So when it comes to webhooks, that means your software is sending a notification to your software. Now, it's not always your software, of course. A lot of times it's a third-party services software. So going back to that sale thing, let's say, for instance, you run a Shopify store or you have a Stripe application, you can actually send webhooks without integrating those tools directly, but send a webhook or a notification with some data that then your workflows can run through. Webhooks are great. It's something you might end up doing. You can also do form submissions in N8n. You can actually build out forms. I typically stay away from this one myself, mostly because I think webhooks are better, and then you can use something like Typeform to use your forms to build out forms there. You can also use something like Google Forms to build out your forms as well, where there's a lot of other automations that are in there. But it is cool that N8n has the ability to create forms and you can collect things from there. Also, other workflows can trigger this workflow too. You can have chat messages, and then there's other things in here too, like file changes, which is pretty cool. So maybe on your local machine that we are running because of our self-hosting, what I mean by local machine in this case is actually your server. So it's not exactly local to you, but it is local to N8n. So on your server, you would be able to monitor for file changes and all that. But in our case, what we want to do is we want to actually use something called IMAP. So we'll go ahead and look in here for IMAP. This is the email trigger itself that is an event. So when your email inbox gets a new email, IMAP is going to actually check that email for you and then give you some sort of response back from it. So what we see here is the trigger itself. Naturally, we got to set up our credentials. We've got an inbox that we're looking for. Then we're also going to have an action for IMAP. So with IMAP, we can automatically say something is read. I would say leave it to nothing so that your email inbox isn't automatically changing yet. I mean, maybe at some point you'll do that. You also might want to download attachments. The nice thing about this is at some point in the future, you can download these attachments and put them in like Dropbox or a more robust service like AWS, S3, which is of course something you could do. I'm not going to do that right now. All I really want to do is listen for very specific emails, right? And that's it. Let's set up the email trigger in N8n, which of course uses the IMAP protocol. Now, IMAP itself has been around for a long time. So if you've ever used Apple Mail or Outlook or any other mail client that's reading and sending email for you, the reading part is done using IMAP. The sending part is done using something different, which we'll see soon, called SMTP. But the idea here is, of course, in your workflow, we already have this trigger on here. If you forgot to add that trigger, just go ahead and search for email, and you'll see two different email things. One is the trigger, the other one is the result, or something you'll use in the workflow. So again, the workflows have to start with the trigger. So I'm going to go ahead and do the email trigger being when email comes in, we're going to go ahead and run an automation. So the way we're going to do this, of course, is by adding in a new credential here, and then we need to fill all of this out. Now this process, I'm going to be using Google for, so I need to go to myaccount.google.com/app passwords. Google in particular has a way to make these like one-off disposable passwords that we can use in other tools. Instead of writing our actual password, whatever that might be, you probably don't want to put that in there, right? This one right here that it's trying to fill in is to log into N8n, which might be a little confusing because I'm going to be using that email. But the idea here is this password right here, I typically do not want to use my actual email password. And with a lot of these automations, I don't want to use my actual email either, which is why you see that I'm using just automate co. And then also I've got this other one called Hungry Pie. So I use a lot of other email addresses to actually handle some of these automations as I see fit. Before I actually fully trust the system, I want to test it out is kind of the point there. So the idea now is we go to myaccount.google.com/app passwords. We hit enter and you'll see something like this to log in. In my case, it's looking for a passkey so that I can log in securely. I can now create one of those one-off passwords, which I'll do now. I'm going to call this my N8n workflow and IMAP PW or password. I'm going to go ahead and hit create and it gives me this generated app password. Now, what I mean by disposable is I can delete that and it no longer gives access to my email account at all. So I'd have to do it again. So in this case, I might want to do something like my actual domain name. So I would come in here and grab my domain name and then I'll say N8n IMAP password, right? And hit create and there we go. So now we got a brand new one. And of course you could always rewind it to see that fact, but I'm going to go ahead and copy this password now, bring it on in as my password. And then my user is going to be my same user that I just used, which is just automateco@gmail.com. And then the host itself is going to be IMAP and imap.gmail.com, which you could always search on Google, say IMAP, host for Gmail, something like that. And then you'll see that these results are usually really good for internal Google things. But even if that doesn't work, you could always look at their documentation as well. There's a lot of different places you can go to find what the host is and all of these other configuration. The other nice thing about using N8n though is as soon as you do something like an IMAP, you hit save, what this is going to do is it's going to attempt to connect you. So in this case, it didn't actually connect. So I have an issue here. So maybe my app password was incorrect. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it again and paste the new one in here and hit retry. Seems like it's not working. So maybe just automate. Let's go ahead and try that one again. So just automate co@gmail. Maybe that was the problem. Couldn't figure out exactly what the problem was. All I did was delete the old one and create a brand new one. So I'll go ahead and delete that one now. Okay, great. So now I've got these IMAP account in here. In this case, I'll go ahead and say Gmail IMAP account. I'm renaming the credential itself, so it's a lot easier to locate later. I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment. We save this now. I don't need to update this password because again, that password is for logging into N8n. I'm going to go ahead and hit X there. This password right here is for N8n to log into our Gmail account. I know it like sometimes the password manager doesn't get it right. And with N8n, you're going to see that a lot, which is part of the reason I'm showing you that. Okay, so now that we've got this, I'm going to go ahead and close this out here. It's saved. The connection worked. Now the action that I'm going to do is not mark as read. I'm going to do nothing. I don't actually want N8n to change anything in my inbox at this time, unless of course I created an entire inbox specifically for N8n, which is a really good idea. But at this point, I don't have that. So I'm just going to go ahead and say it says nothing, and I'm going to hit execute step. And all I want to see here is something coming back. In this case, I do have a bunch of things in here that are coming back, and I can take a look at what's going on. And the main thing is we can see that where it's coming from. So this is a problem. This is not what I want to filter out. This is not what I want to auto respond to. I'm only going to auto respond to messages that come from this other email address that I control, mostly as a proof of concept. But before we actually do that part, I want to show you where you might need to change your passwords for this email trigger, where you update your credentials. Before I go any further though, I will say you should save this workflow. You might want to rename it as IMAP to SMTP auto responder or something like that. The reason I have those dashes in there and it's all lowercase is because I write software a lot, so that's where I default to. You probably don't need to do that. You can probably name it however you like. I just want to make it as clear to me in the future as possible as to what's going on, and having those things named in a certain way makes that, I think, a lot easier. When it comes to something as sensitive as email and the fact that app passwords exist, we really need to know how to change the credentials for that on the fly. The way you do this is by going back into the root of N8n, the homepage of N8n, and then you click over to the Credentials tab, and you will see your Gmail IMAP account credential. You open this one up. This, of course, is where you can change it. Now, in this case, I might also go ahead and grab the actual user itself on here, especially if you have a lot of these. And so you just put that username right in the label so that then when you go to look at it again, you can see there's the label right there. It's very clear. It's very easy to access what that is. And also searching for things become easier as well if you have the username in that account. Now, if a lot of people end up using this, I don't know, maybe you want to do this, maybe not. It's going to be up to you. But the idea is now that we've got this, I want to go ahead and change the password here. That means that I go back into my account .com/app passwords, and then I go ahead and search in here, and I can go ahead and create a new password, in which case I will just grab this password now, and I will rotate it over into that password, and I'll hit retry as far as the test is concerned. Looks like everything's good in terms of those passwords. Now, all of my workflows that use that are going to be good to go. I don't want to update my N8n password that Google has saved, so I'm going to go ahead and ignore that altogether. And then as a final step, I'll go ahead and remove that previous password. Now I just have one, and all of it ends up working just fine. So using these credentials is a very critical step to being able to build out your automations, and then rolling those passwords is a good security practice to get in the habit of. Now, of course, if you know other credentials, you could do that right now. So you could add additional ones in here. So say, for instance, instead of saying create workflow, you would hit this drop down and hit create credential. This time I'm going to go ahead and add in my SMTP credentials. I'm going to go ahead and click that, hit continue. This time I'm going to go ahead and do SMTP account. And I think we also want to use the justautomateco@gmail.com. And so once again, I'll go ahead and do my Gmail SMTP account with that same data. I'm going to bring in my user here now. The host is smtp.gmail.com, which of course you could verify like I did with the IMAP one. You just go into Google itself and just do SMTP host, and there you go. So SMTP is how you send email. IMAP is how you receive it. SMTP is how you send it. So now what I'm going to do is go back into my app passwords once again and copy the name here, but instead of it being IMAP, it's going to be SMTP, and we can go ahead and hit create, and now we have a password to send things that I can then go ahead and bring back into N8n, hit save. Of course, it's going to test the connections. If it fails, it won't even save it, if I remember correctly. If it doesn't fail, then you're good to go, and in which case you can start setting up SMTP. Once again, Chrome is like, hey, do you want to update it? No, I do not. Okay, cool. So I now have two different passwords in here. Now, one of the questions you might have is, can you use the same app password for both things? As far as Google is concerned, yes, you absolutely can. You would just need to make mark of it that they are the same password, which is totally fine. But I wanted to show you how to do both of them. Now, in the future, I might need to create another SMTP account, but for now, this looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and actually create that autoresponder now. Back into N8n, into our workflow here, we're going to go ahead and create our autoresponder. It's really simple. We can hit plus here, and we can look for email in terms of what happens next. We can also hit tab and search for email. We can also hit this plus and search for email, and we'll find send email. I'm going to go ahead and hit send email. Okay, so we already have the Gmail SMTP account on here, so I didn't need to create a new one. The operation is going to be send. The from email is going to be our email address, which of course is justautomateco@gmail.com. The to email, well, I don't see anything for my to email. So what I've got here is this thing saying wire me up. So let's close out of this for a moment, and I notice that it's off to the side here. So the reason it's off to the side is because I didn't use this plus. So how I connect these things is by just grabbing that line. You don't have to hit the plus, you just kind of grab the line here, and then you bring it on over, and now it's all wired up. It still says X though, because it's not completely finished out. But what we can do is we can execute previous nodes. This is going to be something that would be related to this one. Let's see if this ends up working. Here we go. So we want to listen for this, and we might need to actually send a message. So let's jump into that other email address here, and I'm going to go ahead and do just automate co, and we'll say hello world, and then I'll put some gibberish, send it, and then mostly so that I can actually see this come through with IMAP. Now, of course, we need to see in Gmail, is it actually reading in here? Do we actually have that message yet? It's not quite in Gmail yet, and there it is finally. Going back into my workflow, there it is finally as well. Okay, so I actually have a message that then I can finish the automation off with. So going into the send email node, I can now see all of this data. So what's important about this is the fact that the previous node is now this node right here. The output from it is now the input to the next node. This hopefully is very clear. This is how a lot of workflows work, is they kind of travel the data from one node to another. In this case, our send email node now has access to what happened in the email trigger. Now, a big part of the reason you need to run the workflow manually is so you can build out the workflow itself. So each node that you add, you want to build out that workflow. And so what we've got here is a bunch of information about that previous email. Depending on which one you select, you will want to break things down. The schema is one that's really nice when you're first starting out, because then you can see all of the different attributes that are coming in here and you can move them around. So for example, this from email, I can actually bring that into my to email, right? The actual configuration for the next step. This is automatically filling out some, what looks sort of like maybe a foreign language to you if you've never seen code before. But of course, if you have seen code and you've worked in templating engines, this is just a template that's coming through based off of the structure from the previous one. So I think this drag and drop nature, while might not be super intuitive at first, is one of the things that makes N8n very powerful for those of you who are not developers or have no interest in being a developer. You can just drag these things around and you can put them in all sorts of places, right? So that's what we end up using then. So let's say, for instance, this date. Let's put the date in here as our subject. Is that how we reply to emails? No. What we do is we use the original subject, and then a lot of times you'll see RE colon, and I think it's all lowercase like that. So for a long time, the email clients that were out there that had autoresponders, that's what they all did. And so I think Gmail is now at a point where it's intuitive enough or intelligent enough that it knows how to thread these things. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Next is going to be the format you want to send, which is going to be text. And then of course you can write whatever response text you want to have. This, let's go ahead and just write out, this is my autoresponder. How are you? Okay. And now I can execute this step. This literally sent an email. If SMTP was done correctly, it would have sent you an email. In which case you can go back into your email account and you can see this stuff in here. This is my autoresponder. How are you? Great. It does have this little tagline that is sent automatically with N8n, which we can change by going back into the send email node, going into add option, and then append N8n attribution, take that off. Now it's not going to send it anymore, which we can test in a little bit. You can also do a carbon copy or a blind carbon copy. You can copy other people on it. You can add attachments. You can also hit a different reply to, which in case of automations, this is actually going to be really great. So if you have a automation tool that's going to send out your emails, you might want your reply to go to something different, like just automate reply email, so that when the person hits reply, it goes to that email, not the same one that it was sent from. Now, of course, I'm not going to do that. That's just something cool to know about and something that's important. So now what I'm going to do is just hit save. So the automation's done, right? Well, not quite. We have a very simplistic automation here, but the reason it's not done is because it's currently inactive. So I need to make it active in order for N8n to constantly listen all of this stuff to happen. And so right now I'm going to go ahead and say, got it, save that in there. Then I'm going to go back into my other email address. I'm going to delete this previous email. I'm going to compose a brand new one, and I'll go ahead and say, let's make sure I'm in here all the way. This is a live email, and are you working? And hit send. Not even going to look at the other one. Now, of course, this process takes however long it takes because of Google's email accounts. They're very, very rarely actual real time. Actual real time, like a chat message, like Slack, for example, is really, really close to real time. So it's a lot different than that. It happens after some sort of delay. It's not a huge delay usually, but it certainly is a delay. So if everything was done correctly, then we should see an email come through or a response come back here from our email, assuming that it's even in this other inbox. There's that other inbox, and if I refresh in here, we will see there it is. So the autoresponder came right back. If I send another one, and we could let that run for a moment, you will probably see another auto response. So one of the downsides of our current setup is the fact that it does automatically respond, not actually taking into account who's sending it. Maybe you don't want an autoresponder to everyone, but one specific email, which is why we use something called a condition to make sure that that happens. Let's take a look at how to build out conditions now. Before we do, I'm going to deactivate this because I don't want this running all of the time. I want to make sure I have those conditions before I have it running all of the time. In between our email trigger and our send email, I'm going to go ahead and hit this plus here, and we're going to look for something called flow. So flow allows us to manage the flow of the data. It is also known as control flow in programming, but the idea here is we want to add in an if statement that will quite literally decide whether or not one route should run or the other one. So let's go ahead and bring this one in. I'll hit if there. I'm not going to do anything just yet, but I will look at what ends up happening when I do this. So by default, it brings in my send email to the true condition. The false condition has nothing on there, but you could build out a whole nother workflow or a whole nother path that the data could go if it is false. So in the if condition, I'll now open this one up. So with if conditions, what it does is it takes into account what the data type is for what's coming through with this email trigger. If you're not familiar with data types, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever, but the idea is a number has a specific data type, mostly so that you can actually do math on it. But the thing is, with email, most everything is going to be a string, unless it's a file attachment, which is a little bit different, but almost everything is called a string. The date object here, likely going to be treated as a string. It's certainly possible that it can also be treated as a date time object as well. So this is actually really nice because then N8n understands that, hey, we want to make sure that it's like before some other date. That is actually pretty compelling as well in terms of conditions. So what happens in N8n is it will actually check what the data type is. If we look at the subject, for example, and we bring this one in, let's go ahead and bring the subject right here, then it's going to want to go to string. So it's going to go up here instead of these other ones. So when it comes to a number, let's say for instance 10, it will identify it as 10, and then you can, kind of guess if it's greater than or equal to. Numbers aren't really that relevant in the email trigger, but of course the date and time was. Boolean is like a true or false value. We'll see that at some point, I'm sure. Array is like a list of items, and then object would be a different type of scenario that we're not going to talk about here, but it is something that's pretty interesting. Okay, so we've got subject in here, and let's say, for instance, we always want our subject to be exactly equal to hello world. That's it. Then now my if condition means that the only autoresponder events that will happen is if the subject is equal to hello world. Now, of course, what I actually want is I want to know what it's from or what the user or who's sending this to me. So the way I would do this is by literally copying and pasting the data that came through already from the email trigger, just like that, right? And so this is giving me exactly the from parameter here or the from element that is from the schema itself, and then it gives me the exact answer that I had recently. Now, this might not look like an email to you just yet, so I will adjust this in a little bit, but the idea overall is this is the email address that's coming through. So of course, if you don't actually see this data right here, all that means is you need to run this trigger and you need to make sure that it is working correctly, which in this case for IMAP would mean that I need to actually run, an email to myself, right? So like whatever gibberish in here, hit send, and then of course, this trigger will then end up working because I'm listening for that event to happen. And whenever that email lands, then it will have that output data. When you're designing any node, you need to have the previous node's output data to really get the effect that you're looking for. And of course, sometimes that previous node, the data that's going to come through is going to be really obvious. Sometimes that's not, right? And so in this case, the email output gets fed into if, and then we can see those various items in here that we might want to use, okay? And so we also have this UUID. This actually might come in as a number. So let's go ahead and say UUID, and there it is. There's a number. Pretty cool. I'll delete that though, because we don't actually need that. But now that we've got this step here, I can go ahead and execute step. Now the reason this works perfectly is because I took the attribute itself, so from, and used that one in this expression. And then I made sure that it was equal to the exact value that's right here. But of course, your intuition might be a little bit different than that. Your intuition might be like, oh, it's going to be equal to just this email. Now when I go to execute the step, the true branch is now empty and the false branch is not empty, even though the email address is this. This is where playing around with the conditions is going to be really an important thing. So instead of is equal to, you might have something like contains, and then you would execute that step, and in which case it now does that. You could also do something like a regular expression, so matches a regular expression. This is not a regular expression right here, but what you could do is you could open up like ChatGPT and say, hey, I need a regular expression for this email. And then it will probably give you one, in which case you could test it on this step as well. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and just say something along the lines of contains, just so that I know that my from email, the sender itself has this in that whole thing. And then I can execute that step and so on. So right here, this right here is just a label for that email address. This is something that a lot of email addresses do. They don't always just have the raw email. That's why when you actually look at the email, you can see who it's from and it doesn't just show you their email address. That's essentially what's happening right there. But there we go. So now we have this condition that will send the email based off of what's coming through or based off of who's actually sending it. And I can go ahead and hit save. This time I'm going to go ahead and activate it once again. And I'll go ahead and say that's okay. It's going to automatically fire this, which is what I want. I'm going to go ahead and it looks like this might have even responded to me based off of what I just did. But let's go ahead and do it again. And we'll say just automate co. And I'll say with conditions and some gibberish, hit send, and naturally that's going to take the time it takes. But this is a very simple workflow that allows for us to do, I think, fairly complex things, or at least start that process, especially because of this if statement here that we can have. And naturally in the false, I could put in another sort of workflow in here that I might want to use for it as well, which of course would then mean that it's not working exactly like it should, but rather maybe a little bit different. And so the autoresponder hasn't responded just yet. There's the with conditions there. Let's go ahead and see if it's working yet. It looks like it's active. Everything's on. Let's see if we get anything. And there it goes. I want things to work faster than they do a lot of times, but here it is. And so notice the reply email here doesn't have any sort of label to it or any sort of name. If you wanted to add that sort of name or label, you could say something like this, where you do just automate and then you add in those brackets around your email address, in which case this also would do the same sort of thing. And it's a lot faster this time around, but there is that label now if you are trying to have those labels. So this condition showed us a number of things that are really interesting about email, but at the very end of it all is we now have an autoresponder that's very specific to specific emails, which I think is pretty great. So we want to use our user's Gmail account, like directly Gmail and the Gmail API. The only way we can do this is if we create an app with Google. That app will basically allow our N8n project to connect to a user's Google account. This process is called OAuth, and hopefully it'll be a little bit more clear actually after we actually set it up. So first off, inside of our account here, we're going to go into credentials in N8n. We're going to go ahead and create a credential, and we're going to look for Gmail OAuth 2 API. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit continue. Now take note of this screen. We've got OAuth redirect, client ID, and client secret. There is another way to do this if we were to go into a workflow and create a new workflow, do a new step in here, and do something like Gmail, grab Gmail, on message received. Obviously, we need to create a new credential. And here we have two options. We have OAuth 2 and service account. In my opinion, OAuth 2 is going to be the easiest thing to set up for the vast majority of you. So that's what we're going to end up doing. So you can kind of take it either method as you like. In this case, I'll go ahead and do Gmail auto draft response, because that's really what I'm trying to build towards here, but using the Gmail trigger. Now, if you look in the Gmail node, there's a lot of other things you can do than just that trigger. So with this saved, I'm going to go back into those credentials, and we'll go ahead and create a new credential for that Gmail OAuth 2. Of course, if you search other things for Google, you probably will see other kinds of things in here, like Sheets OAuth 2 and so on. So the Google one is, OAuth 2 is very, very common with Google, is kind of the point here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and use the Gmail OAuth 2 API. We'll hit continue, and here we go. So the idea is we need to take this URL and bring it into Google. From Google, we'll get a client ID and a client secret. All of those things, if they're done correctly, will mean that our user, our own user on N8n, will log into Google. Google will send something back to N8n. That's what OAuth is all about. I'm sure you've done it before. Let's see it in practice. So the way you make this work is by going to cloud.google.com and hitting on console. Inside of your console here, you're going to need to create a new project. Now, what we're going to be doing here should not cost you anything. Now, if it does at some point, that might change, but Google Cloud itself is massive. It does a lot of things. So realistically, what you would be using for Google Cloud in the near future, as long as it's like an N8n automation, it's probably going to be things like Gmail, Google Sheets, maybe even Google Gemini, their LLM. So there's a lot of stuff that you can use inside of Google Cloud. All we need to do, though, is create a project, and I'm going to make a new project in here, and I'll go ahead and say my N8n or something like that, and maybe I'll put my actual domain name in here too, and just call it my N8n Hungry Pie. Probably .com doesn't work in there. It doesn't look like it does, so I'll get rid of that. Okay, you can add an organization and all that. You can also add and connect to a whole bunch of projects. So basically, Google Cloud allows you to have a bunch of different projects. As you can see, I already have one that has a test, but I ended up deleting that one. Now I'm going to just use this one right here. So the idea here is we want to go into our different services that will allow for this. So if I actually do a quick search for like OAuth client, what I'll probably see is something like this credentials page or managing OAuth. There's a lot of different things that we can do in here. Another thing I can look for is APIs and services. This one right here is likely where we're going to need to go. So I'm going to jump into this one, and I'll go ahead and start the process of an OAuth consent screen. Okay, so I want you to know, if anything about Google Cloud is confusing, you're with literally everyone else, including professionals that do this all of the time and have a bunch of certifications in Google Cloud. This is true for a lot of cloud providers because they have a lot of services and it starts to get really complicated. There is a rhyme to it, but knowing how to do everything can be really tricky. Doing this process, I think watching this, but also using something like Google Gemini or any sort of LLM could potentially help you figure these things out too, because I found that to be very useful. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is this OAuth consent screen right here. So I want to start off where I'm creating some sort of connection to Google before I do any sort of permissions or anything like that. So this connection is going to be the OAuth overview or the OAuth connection screen. Notice that it took me somewhere else to now the Google Auth platform. So this is a new one that Google does. So Google Auth platform. And so this adds to the level of confusion is that there's a lot of different ways to set this OAuth stuff up. But I like using the APIs one. I like going to the APIs one to do the OAuth stuff because the APIs one will allow for me to enable the Google Gmail account, or rather the Google Gmail API, which we'll see in a little bit. Okay, so the OAuth screen, let's go back to this. We're gonna go ahead and hit getting started. What's your app name here? Well, mine is gonna be called Hungry Pi N8n. The user support email, just use the one that's there, which is yours, of course. Next, the audience. In this case, it's quite literally an external account. You could do it internally, but that creates a lot of challenges to make sure that that ends up working. Next up, the contact address, just automateco@gmail.com, for Google to notify you about things, okay? And then you're gonna agree to their policies and go and hit create. Okay, so this has now created that part, but all we need to do is create an OAuth client. Hey, there's a theme here, OAuth, and clients, OAuth. Okay, so we're going to create a client. This is our connection. This is basically this will allow N8n to connect. N8n is a type of web application. Even if you're running it on your local machine, it's a web application. This is going to be my N8n workflows, Hungry Pi com. And the reason I'm doing it this way is mostly to kind of connect it to essentially the domain name. You can name it however you want. You can also change it later. All of that stuff is fine. Okay, so we've got this authorized JavaScript origins, which we probably won't need, but I'll just go ahead and grab my domain name here, and then I'm gonna go ahead and add that one in. And then we've got authorized redirect URIs, or basically a URL. It's very similar to that. Okay, so notice that I got an issue here. I can't have that trailing slash. Okay, so the redirect URLs. Maybe you saw this, maybe you didn't. Back in the credentials, we have OAuth redirect URL. That's the one we want. I'm gonna go ahead and copy that, go back into our client here, add in that redirect URL. You can add a bunch of other ones, but I've now added that one in. I'm gonna go ahead and hit create, and this will create our OAuth app. Right out of the gates, what it's doing is it's giving us a client ID, a client secret, and a few others. You can also download this as JSON. It's just basically the same data as a file that you can use. But the important part, again, if you noticed, it says client ID and client secret. What do you know? Client ID and then client secret. Great. Now we've got this sign in with Google thing. I'm gonna go ahead and hit save for now because I don't wanna lose anything. But now that I've got this sign in with Google thing, I can go ahead and hit select. And what do you know? So now it's asking me to start this process. It has my email. Obviously I could select a different one if I wanted to. Whatever you select here will eventually be what you use for those Gmail authorizations. So I'm gonna go ahead and select this one. And right now it's blocked. I can't do it. I can't go any further. This is something we'll fix in a little bit when we actually grant API access for a bunch of things. But you can see in the error details, all of the things that we need to be able to do, all of the scope things that we need to have are right inside of this error. Again, we'll come back to that in a little bit. Before I fully finish this off though, I'm gonna keep this in mind as my general Gmail account, right? That's it. Because I will come back here to connect my credentials. If I come back into this Gmail account, notice that the client ID and secret are still in there. But of course, my actual Google account is not. Now, let's say, for instance, I wanted to have more than one Google account in here. Let's go ahead and search for our Gmail account in here. I hit continue. What do you know? It's the same sort of thing. So if I were to have multiple, this would be a good time to think about it. So let's go ahead and say if it was like hungrypie@gmail.com, right? This case, I would go back into that client ID, grab it again, and bring it in here, and then grab the secret again and bring it in here as well. And then once again, I would go ahead and save that, and then I can log in if I want to. So in many cases, you might have a few of those, right? You might actually add like 5 to 6 of them for the Gmail account. The unfortunate part is there's not a really great way that I know of that allows you to just put one in and then it just grants for everyone. So one of the things you would just need to verify though is that the redirect thing is in there. There is a way to share it, but you got to update to do so, which is not something we're going to do. We're just going to go when we need it. Okay. So before we actually access all of the scopes, I will remind you, I'm going to show you how to go from 0 on Google Cloud. So we're back on 0. How do I actually re-access this? Again, think what it is that you're doing. You could think Google Auth. So Google Auth platform, you are authenticating with Google. I like to think of OAuth. I just think OAuth, and then OAuth clients is fine. If I search for OAuth clients, it might give me the correct place, which goes into credentials. It sort of does. I'm going to select that project, and what do you know? There is the OAuth credentials right here. Here's the client ID. If I go to edit it, I should be able to get this secret in there as well. Notice that that old secret is no longer available. So I'd have to add a new one if I were to add, like actually use a new one. As in if I needed to add another user in here, I would just add a new one. You also might get to the point where you have to delete one. Notice that you can pretty much have 2 of them at this point. So that's kind of a bummer, but overall, that's what you would end up doing. Now, not to worry, if all of that fails, you could just add another client as well. So you would just come in here and you would go ahead and say you're going to create credentials of another OAuth client ID, and in which case you would just do the same process that we just did, authorize URLs, redirect, all of that sort of stuff, and at any time you can delete this stuff. We're going to stick with just one to make it as simple as possible. But there's nothing magical about this. Now, if you were going to be building a web app and you have thousands of users, you're probably not going to want to delete these things all the time. But every once in a while, you might end up getting into the place where you do. So just keep that in mind. Now, overall, the actual client itself is what connects to the project itself. So it's not always something that you have to be super worried about. In other words, you can have a bunch of different client IDs that are actually just going basically to the same thing. That's kind of the point. We'll see that more when we start granting access. Back into N8n, we're going to jump into the Credentials tab and then select our Gmail account here. And we're going to attempt to sign in with Google. And then I'll go ahead and hit my username. I'm also going to go ahead and copy the email right now. But I see that, of course, access is blocked because it has not completed the verification process. Now, we can also see stuff about the developer information and error details. Those we'll look at in just a moment. The key here, though, is it says it's blocked because it hasn't completed the verification. So if we go back into Google Cloud and search for the Google Auth platform, jump on over into that, navigate into Audience, what you can see is you can go to Publish Your App. But this app is just for us. We don't need to publish it. Instead, we need to add in some test users. Those test users are going to be ourselves. You can add in other users as well, but just go ahead and add in your test user. So in my case, if I wanted to add in something like hungrypie@gmail.com, I could probably do that as well, right? To log in as that user as well. So now going back into N8n and going to sign in again, let's see what happens here. Still hasn't verified the app, but I can hit continue. And then it's now asking for all of this, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say, yeah, you can have all of that access and hit continue. And then we get a successful connection. Okay, so I've signed in and I can reconnect at any time. Great. One of the things I want to verify though is my app itself has that data enabled. So if you had any issues of what you just saw, we're going to clarify those issues right now. So inside of apps or APIs and services rather, you're going to select that and then you're going to go into library and then you're going to do a quick search for Gmail or the Gmail API, which of course is going to be this one right here. Then you're going to want to enable this. So if you didn't have it enabled before, you will have it enabled now. I did some tests, which is why mine might have worked back in N8n where maybe yours didn't. Once you have it enabled, your app now needs the scope in there. So if you go back into the OAuth consent screen, this of course brings you back into the Google Auth platform. And then we have this thing called data access in here. So this is where we want to add in our Gmail scope. So I'm going to go ahead and add or remove scopes, and I'm just going to search for the Gmail API, and in which case I'll select everything. I might need to have a few more rows in here to make sure that that's all working, but I'm just granting scope access to all of them. And so the idea here that's important is that you aren't using anybody else. Nobody outside of yourself is going to be using this scopes. If you're asking for this information from somebody you don't know, get prepared to not get that information and potentially be blocked by Google at some point as well. So keep that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then we'll do some automations in a moment. The other important part about this, the thing that might not be as obvious, is when you log in somewhere. Let's go ahead and see that again. If I were to re-sign in, anytime you log in somewhere where it's saying hasn't verified, of course, that's a big security warning. In our case, we know that. You've been tested. You've been given access to work on one that's being tested. Makes sense. We hit continue. Then, of course, it wants to access all sorts of services. Of course, you don't always want to do this. But if you were to do this on any other service and you don't have control over these things, well, guess what? You just granted all of this access to them, and they can access your accounts as they see fit. Which, of course, I hope a lot of you already know, but self-hosting N8n gives us complete control over this process, which is so nice, I think. Granted, there's more setup that we need to do, but overall, it gives us and unlocks a lot of potential for us. So yeah, now we have the ability to start using the Gmail API in our systems. So at this point, you can go into the Credentials tab and delete your Gmail SMTP as well as your Gmail IMAP because you've got your Gmail account already connected with the API. In fact, I'm going to delete the Hungry Pie one because I don't need that anymore. I really just need the one single Gmail account. I'll leave these other ones here in case you want to use them in the future. But the idea here is we want to duplicate our original IMAP autoresponder here. And this time I'm going to just call it my Gmail autoresponder. And I really just want to recreate what we already have done with the SMTP and IMAP. So the way I'm going to do this is by opening up the tab here, searching for Gmail, and then in Gmail, I want to go ahead and look for the triggers, which is down at the bottom here. And so you would look for the search of on message received, and then you can bring this trigger in. Notice I have the Google account in here, and then I also have a way to check it, which is however often you want to check it. You could do it every minute, you can do it every week, whatever, right? And so every X is pretty interesting, so you could probably even change this. Looks like you can't do it every second, which is probably good. You don't really need to check your email that quickly. Nevertheless, we've got this in here, and then we've got a few other features that we'll look at in a little bit. I fetched this out, and I've got no Gmail data here at this time, which is interesting because I do. Let's see if I can go ahead and send myself something else with this other one, and we'll just go ahead and do that real quick. And there we go. So back into my workflow here, I'll go ahead and fetch this out. It's probably because I actually changed what that one meant, but let's keep on going until we get new email. There we go. Okay, so I've got some email coming in, and now I can do the next step and all that. Okay, so what's the next step? Well, first off, we can now get rid of that IMAP trigger and bring this up. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this one as well, but I've got my if statement in here. So the from obviously is different. It should be different. The format of it should be different because we're now using something different, right? So it's no longer IMAP. It is now from the Gmail API, which of course does cause the workflow to not work correctly. But the actual API data, I think, is a lot cleaner. So now the actual new one is this from icon here. So I can drag this on over into that one. Notice I've got double in there, so I want to go ahead and get rid of this old one by selecting it and just removing it. And there we go. So it's actually not that different. It was lowercase f, now it's uppercase f. Cool. Very simple. Okay, So we have the from, and then once again, we can use that same string or just leave it as contains. I run that, and what do you know? It works. If I say it is equal to, it goes false, like we saw before. Not that shocking, probably very straightforward. Okay. Next up is going to be our sending our email. Now, of course, I could probably still send the email directly from the SMTP, right? So the from email, like where this is coming from, like who we're sending it to, of course, is a little bit different. It's once again that capital F, but this time we could get it directly from the Gmail trigger. So we could come in here and do something along those lines. And then we can get the subject from the Gmail trigger as well. So we don't even need the if statement. We can actually go backwards, and you'll see what this means in a second. But the idea being the subject in here would then be this subject, like that. So the templating that's going on inside of N8n can be confusing for sure. That's why dragging and dropping it makes it a lot easier to work with. What you notice is it says anything inside those curly brackets is JavaScript. So you can do JavaScript to it. So you can add stuff like adding a plus, and then this is my new subject, right? Or in other words, this RE, instead of putting the RE up front, you can actually put it in this block. You can do RE colon, and then add a plus, and then there you go. Now, of course, if you don't know JavaScript, it kind of just looks weird adding pluses and stuff like that, but that's how it works. That's how you can do these strings and stuff like that. That's why it's called an expression instead of being something fixed. The text, on the other hand, is fixed because I just wrote something there. Okay, so of course, this is still the SMTP one. We could obviously do this and it would obviously work. One of the questions you might be wondering is, what is this? I'll come back to that in a little bit. For now, I'm going to go ahead and delete the send email from here. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick search for Gmail, and then inside of Gmail, I want to send a message. Okay, so am I going to be sending a message or am I going to be replying to a message? There we go. So I can actually have a reply right in here. And then I've got a message ID. What is that message ID? Well, we could look in the if statement. We could also look in the Gmail trigger. I would prefer to look in the if statement. The message ID is literally the ID from the email. So we can just go ahead and bring that on over. And then the message itself, what we want to respond is say, that is nice. Thanks. That's it. You now have a reply. It's going to be treated differently than just sending an email. I'm going to leave it in as text. I'm going to go ahead and execute this. And naturally, what we would end up seeing is we would get the reply that goes into a thread. Great. So we're not quite at the draft yet, but we're really close. Now, there is one important thing to note is this right here. So what this is doing is it's selecting a node in our workflow. As long as that node is connected to the workflow, or at least connected to this node in some way, we can probably access it. And the way we know this is by testing things, of course, dragging and dropping that stuff. You're going to learn those things really well. But also, it's just basically getting the label of what that thing is. So if I go back into this Gmail trigger here and open that up and change the label to, let's say, for instance, my Gmail new message trigger and hit enter, I change the label of it. I go back into my reply message. Whoa, look at that. It says Gmail new message trigger. So N8n updates these things intelligently so that they just work. This, of course, is great for our own workflows, but can lead to challenges if we wanted to share this workflow with someone else or reuse it, because the Gmail trigger, again, looking back in, what the default name is going to be Gmail trigger, right? So we probably want to stick with those default names unless for some reason we have a good reason to not stick with them, right? Sometimes you'll want to change them, sometimes not. The reason I'm saying that is because this block right here, I can actually copy. I can bring it other places. I can select it and do Control-C or Command-C. Notice it said copy to clipboard. And then I can go into, let's save this one. Then I can go into another workflow, let's say like the Gmail autoresponder in here, or rather not that one. Let's go ahead and leave that one and go into the auto draft one. I could paste that in. this one is now going to reference that same Gmail trigger. But notice that it's red is because it's not wired. They're not connected. As soon as I connect them, then it's connected. This is not exactly wrong. But of course, I don't actually want this in terms of my workflow. I don't need multiple auto triggers or auto responders. That's it. So it's actually really nice. Now I can activate this. And once again, I can then go ahead and create another message. And I'll go ahead and say another live one here, send it. And then really quickly, it's going to respond. It probably won't necessarily respond as quickly as the IMAP, mostly because it's only going to check every minute. And that's kind of the limitation of this one. So one of the things you could also do is you could actually implement something called a schedule. Let's take a look. Back into N8n, we're going to do something fairly interesting. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the Gmail autoresponder now. I'm going to actually turn it off as well, but we'll go ahead and say Gmail messages autoresponder. Ooh. Go ahead and duplicate that, and we'll take a look. So now the trigger is going to change to a schedule. So we'll go ahead and grab our schedule trigger, and we're going to do this. Hey, look at that. I could do it every few seconds, or I could do it every minute. I'm going to do it every minute. If I hit execute step, it's just going to run. I don't actually care what comes through with that schedule, but what I will care about is the next part. I'm going to go ahead and delete this email trigger in here now because we no longer need that one. Our new trigger is just this schedule here. Now I could also do a trigger that is click, or let's say, let's look at that trigger, which is the manual trigger, I think. Manual trigger, that's the name. Bring that one in as well. And now I'm going to go ahead and look for a bunch of different messages. So let's go into Gmail here, and we'll go ahead and say get many messages. The limit in our case, we'll just go ahead and say 5. Okay, so we've got to simplify here. I also have another filter, and we can go into read status, like unread emails only. Cool. Or we could do both. Let's do unread. Great. I hit execute step. If I execute that step, I get a bunch of emails in here. That's pretty neat. Right? There we go. Cool. So I've got my unread emails in here. So now on my schedule trigger here, I could go ahead and take a look at all of the different emails I've got. But we've got a problem. There's going to be 5 of them coming through. So how do we reply to them? How do we have this part working? What we can do is another flow that's called a loop. Let's go ahead and loop it. The batch we're going to do is 1. We want to look at 1 at a time. That's kind of the idea here. When you start dumping data into like Google Sheets, you'll probably have a much bigger batch size. Right now, we're going to go ahead and do 1. If I execute this step, it's going to do it for the number of messages right previous to this. Okay. So what we got now is this top node that says done and this bottom node that is a loop. Let's take a look at this replace me. So as it's looping over each iteration, we've got 1 item here. We see all of the data that we're looking for. Cool. What is it that I'm looking to do with all of this data? Let's go ahead and close this one out, and we're going to connect our loop to the if statement, and then the reply message is going to come on in there as well. So I want the reply message to go all the way back so the loop can continue. For now, though, I'm going to leave off that reply message and only put true back or only put false back. So basically, either way, I want the loop to continue. So if I were to execute this step, I will see true or false branches coming through in here. Let's go ahead and actually run our entire workflow now. So it's going to loop through, and some of them are going to be true and some of them are false. You can see that by the lines right here. When I'm not on those lines, it shows me 3 items and 2 items. Great. So which is which, of course, is another story. The true items is going to be the top one. That's actually kind of tricky to figure out which is which. So I'm going to bring it on over here and then delete that top line. There we go. Cool. So if it is true, we're going to go ahead and reply that message, but I don't really want to break the loop. I want the loop to keep going. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that back into the loop itself. So when it's true, it's going to go ahead and send a reply message. This time our message ID has changed a ton. right? So the message ID itself will now come from the if statement because, well, first of all, we don't have that Gmail trigger anymore, but also we're going to be looping over this data. We're going one by one. Imagine like we're going row by row by row. And when it's on one of those loops, we do a condition. Hey, is the from email, from hungrypie@gmail? If so, then we're going to go ahead and reply to it. Now we need to know that if statement being true, that's the ID I now want to use, which is going to be related to this one right here. And then of course, then we have some sort of message response in there that we'll be able to do. Okay, so before I actually run this, what I want to do though, is I'm going to go ahead and go back into my inbox here, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete everything. Hopefully now I have no red messages. So if I were to run through this, they should be there should be none, basically. No loops going through, 0 items. Let's go ahead and execute that. So it gets many messages. It's now saying 3 items. So it's certainly possible that maybe somewhere in here I've got some data that's been stored that is, well, not what I want. But of course, if we come back in here, it's still getting some stored data. I went into my archive off the video and tried it again. Now I think maybe that archive, yeah, that doesn't show me anything. So my archive probably has a few other items that are in there. So this also might mean that I want to have my filter to be maybe a little bit done differently than this, right? So label names or ID. So what are the label names? Inbox, right? So is it in my inbox? Before, I don't know if it was just doing my inbox. I think it was just doing everything that was unread, basically. So let's go ahead and execute this step now. Now I got nothing. I've got literally no data in there, and now we run it through. Great. So the experimentation, of course, has to be there. You have to continuously experiment. So now, of course, I'm going to go ahead and return back some data. So going in to my Gmail account, I'll go ahead and run this to just automate and loop it up. Yeah. Or some gibberish. Okay. And then, of course, I would need to wait for this, or I could always make this active. I now made it active. I've got a scheduled trigger in here that's going to check every minute, which may happen really soon. It may happen off the video, but there it is. We've got an email coming through in here, and then eventually we're going to go ahead and loop through all of this. Obviously, I could wait for the actual scheduled trigger to go, or I could just run it just to see that that's working, and what do you know? There it goes. So one of the downsides as to what I just did is I kind of have a loop that won't stop. In other words, if I run it again, if I didn't open it, it would just keep sending messages. Keep sending messages. Because it's not actually marking that as read. So that would be another thing that you can definitely do, is mark a message as read after you reply to it. But that's not something I'm going to do at this time. It's just something to understand for the motivation to just do drafts. Not just automatically respond all the time, because it's really easy to get in one of these loops where you're constantly responding, especially if you have a schedule trigger and all that, in which case I'm going to go ahead and turn off this schedule trigger and just leave it as is. But now you have a lot of other new tools that you can use at your disposal. The Get Many Messages node turns back a list of items. This list of items might have 10 things, it might have 100. Right now we've got a limit of 5. What if you wanted to have a limit of 500? Well, that actually opens this up a lot. You also might change the filters that come in. I'm going to leave the filters in here to at least the inbox. And in this case, the read status doesn't really matter. Doing unread and read, that's everything. So I'm just leaving inbox. So I'll get rid of that read status and we'll hit execute step. This time I still only have 1 because my inbox only has 1. But at the very least, we have the ability to have a lot more. We could even return all of them, which I don't recommend, especially on a big inbox, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it at some number. We will go ahead and run that and we'll save it. Okay, so our loop here will actually filter these things down because it's going to loop through all of them, get to this if statement. This if statement will make that decision on how to go forward. But what's better is if we actually filter it beforehand. So if we come in here and run a filter and just bring that on in, now we can filter it down based off of a bunch of other criteria, not just an if statement, not just that one condition. So in this case, we could absolutely do the from item once again if we wanted to. Or what we could do is go into our labels and look for things that are labeled. So in our case, it would be something like inbox and unread. But the challenge that we have here is how do we actually do this? If I were to go into labels and then go into array and say contains, let's go ahead and say it contains inbox. I hit execute step, I get that it's discarded. This is not great. So it's filtering things down and it's just discarded. But of course labels, if we look at the actual table itself with that field data, inbox is in there. But for some reason it just discards it. So there's one thing that we can do prior to running our filter that helps us with this, and that is something called edit fields. So editing fields makes it a lot easier to just map things out. Now, if we don't want to edit fields, like as in do nothing, we can just literally include the output from the other input fields and just run that. That gives me all of that same data back. And in which case I go back into that filter, I can execute the same exact step and the same thing happens, still discard it. So what I want to do instead though, instead of do nothing, we're going to go ahead and alter the label list. How we're going to do this is by dragging the label list on over into that field. Notice that it says labels, it's taking the same exact one, and then we've got this array in here, so it quite literally treats the data type as an array, and then we can go on. Now every once in a while you might want to have the original label, so I'll come in here and say labels OG or original, or better yet, I'll go ahead and change the one I'm going to use to labels list. I'll call it labels list. I run this step again, I scroll on down, I see there's labels list, and here's labels. So what we've got now is just more fields. We have more data in here. So there are other customizations I could potentially do in here with all of this, right? So for example, we can go ahead and say from lower, or let's go ahead and use it as camel case, which is what's going on with the casing here. I can actually come in here and bring that from over, and then I can actually go ahead and do something like to lowercase. So I did dot to lowercase. This is a JavaScript transformation that we just did, which is what you can do in these curly brackets. But if I were to run that, I can now see I've got another one that says from lower, and then to, and then from. I've got a lot of good stuff. So I could do all sorts of things within the JavaScript here. This allows me to alter other pieces of the data. But of course, I don't really care about the to from lower case. I don't need that right now. I want to update the labels list to only have one of these two values that's in here. So I can choose the ID, I can choose the name. In this case, it doesn't really matter. So I'll go ahead and go off of the ID itself. So what we can do is there's this JavaScript function called map. Mapping will take in another function that allows us to do something with it. So I can pass in a function in here, an arrow function, and return something along those lines. So it goes x and x.name or x.id, which will give me these values. It's showing me what the result is in here. Now I realize some of you don't know JavaScript at all, and this is incredibly confusing. The way I would approach it in the case of some sort of AI would be to take the raw data, grab the original one and say, hey, I need this to give only the IDs back, or only the name back, or only one value back. Something along those lines, and then you can just test it. In which case you'll see something along these lines. Now, one of the things you want to avoid is this being treated as a string, because if you run that, then you'll see it's different. It's approached different. We want to keep it as an array so that when I execute it, I see that it has this list element in here. So that then I can go into the filter now and I see that it contains, it's almost the same, right? So that's the original one, labels. Now I want to use label list. So I'll get rid of the labels here, bring in labels list. And now I want to run it. This time it did not discard anything, it kept it. If I change it to inbox ABC, it's going to discard that because nothing contains that. Since we just saw how to filter with labels, let's take a look at how we can add a label to a message so that we ensure that we aren't actually repeatedly adding new messages or replying to those messages. So the way this is going to work is going to start off with our standard list here, and then I'm going to go ahead and add in a new one for Gmail, and then I'm going to go ahead and actually get message here. So the idea is after the if statement comes through, I want to actually get this message ID, and then I want to execute that step, and I want to see that there's my message. So the part of the reason I'm doing this is because, well, I've got this query here that's going to grab a bunch of messages. And so right before I reply here, this might be when I actually want to get the information or the label that I'm going to be using. So in actuality, I would probably want to change this if statement here a little bit so it's actually reversed. So we go ahead and do the if statement like this. And so the looped over item is going in there. So this if statement is really, should we actually reply to this message? So let me go back into this message here. I still have that if statement coming through. The if statement now is coming through get message, which is a little bit different than what we did before. So I will stick with give the get message response here. And then of course, get message should just grab that ID. So I did move things around a little bit, but hopefully we're in a good spot. And again, we don't have the same labels. So once again, I might want to use this same sort of label list in here for this. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that one in, and then let's go ahead and cut this out and then bring this one down here. Let's just double check that this works still. I think it still should. It looks like it does. We've got our label list down there. Okay, great. So now in my if statement now, what I want to do here is I'll go ahead and say, and the label list array does not contain, and we'll go ahead and add in some sort of value. What value do we want there? Well, going back into Gmail, let's go ahead and create a label now, and we'll go ahead and say the N8n automated, something like that, N8n automated message. Okay, so that's going to be our label now. I'll go ahead and copy that label, and we'll paste it in here. So it does not contain that. Then it's going to go ahead and start replying the message. And after it replies that message, we then go back into Gmail once again, and then we add a label to that message. So the message ID itself is going to be from the loop, the same as the get message. We could also grab it from get message. It's going to be that same ID. Then we want to add in the label, that N8n automated label, and there we go. So let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to execute this workflow. If everything went correctly, it went through and it labeled all the messages and did everything that it needed to do. I run it again. This time, it may or may not do the same thing, right? And so if I look at my inbox, I still have 2 in here. Those are still labeled. If I run it again, I see that it seems to be going through still, right? One item is still going through in there with the label. So maybe I have the wrong label in here, or maybe I did something incorrect. Let me go back into my alter label list, the first one. If I scroll on over to the label list, the label itself is some weird value. And the reason for that is because I'm not actually using the name, I'm using the ID. So I want to change this to name, execute that step, and now I see that that is the automated message. And of course, the same thing is going to be true down here. And this is going to be alter, let's say, message label list. This one as well, same sort of thing. Run that step, and at some point, it's going to give us that actual value. And now if I go to run it again, I should, in theory, see nothing coming through. So it's coming through, and it's just stopping, right? So the false statement is the thing that we see. Now, of course, I shouldn't even hit the loop over items at that point either. So the filter down here would be and that same value. So once again, we would use that same label list here. And once again, does not contain the N8n automated message, and in which case now it's going to discard those items right out of the box. And so the reason we are doing this extra looping with the same filter stuff is because we're doing this get many message, right? It's really just to do the bulk stuff and to make sure that we're not overloading it. If you were just doing the trigger based off of a new message, then you wouldn't need to do this get message. You would just be doing this one single block right here, like we've already seen. But I wanted to show you something that's a little bit more advanced just to make sure that this is all working correctly. Now, a big part of the reason I have this get message again, so we are grabbing a bunch of data, then we're looping through all of that data. The reason for that is because when we run this trigger, there might be 100 messages in here. By the time we hit message 5, we might have another automation that already does the trigger itself or whatever. The point is that over time, it's going to take a while for all the messages to propagate, in which case messages might change in that time. And if they do change, the loop itself will monitor for that change. It will just make sure that that change didn't happen from the time this whole thing ended up working. So that's how we can add in those labels. Of course, at any time, if we want to, we can remove those labels, we can delete the labels, in which case those messages would be sent once again, right? So we can run that again, and there we go. It now runs it through all of that on each loop. So we've got 2 looped items there, and then 2 received items. And then of course, in our inbox here, we could probably see more messages coming through. And in the other inbox, we'll see a lot of messages coming through because we're just sending a bunch of the same messages. Now, one thing that's really cool to note, or really important to note, is we are getting the primary message thread here. So we're not doing each individual messages. This is a very Gmail specific way on how we're doing everything. So we're getting that top level message. Otherwise, this get many messages would have been like 15 different messages, but it's really just the 2 threaded messages. That's it. It's just those 2 threads in there, and that's it. So that's actually a really nice feature of this as well. So all we need to do now really is, instead of replying to the message, is just create a draft. It's going to be very similar to this, but it will require a little bit of code to make it work. Let's take a look. When it comes to workflow automations, I think it's really important to have a person be a part of some of them. Now, when it comes to responding to messages, sometimes it makes sense to automatically send them. Sometimes it makes a lot more sense to have a draft at the ready. So we can still create workflows that do those drafts. So let's go ahead and do this Gmail auto draft workflow, which just has a Gmail trigger at this point. I'm going to go ahead and fetch the test here, and I do have a message that I'll be able to respond to. This message then, I'll go ahead and come in here and we'll look for Gmail again, and then I'm going to go ahead and grab the draft element here and creating a draft. So notice I don't have very many options for this. I've got a subject and then the message. So I'll go ahead and add in the message being like text, and I'll go ahead and say, this is my response. And then I'll grab the subject in here, which will of course be the original subject, and then I'll just put RE in front of it with a little space, so it responds that way. Naturally, I could do this with JavaScript as well, with RE like that, and then a plus. That also works as well. Either way, it's up to you. Okay, there's our draft. We can look at different options in here, and maybe the thread ID will actually solve this for me. So I'm looking for the thread ID. Let me just go ahead and bring in this thread ID here. I don't know if I need any other options. Maybe I need the from alias name or ID. I'm not sure if we need that or what that would even be. So I'll go ahead and just leave with the thread ID. Okay, so I'll execute this step, and it seems that potentially we've got a draft in here. I come in, and sure enough, there's our draft. But we do have a problem. The 2 is not quite there. So I don't have the 2. So let's go ahead and say to email, and then I'll go ahead and get it from the from response. Okay, and I'll execute that step again, and sure enough, I think this time we will be able to see that. Looks like maybe I'm gonna have to undo this, and let's see here. I think we might need to send ourselves another message, so let's go ahead and do that. And another test, send it. Okay, and I'm gonna delete this one, and then we'll go back into our node here and back into our trigger. Let's just make sure we get something through there. Of course, it's going to take a moment or two. There it is. And there we go. Okay, and then back to our create draft. I'll execute that one, and sure enough, there it goes. And then we come in here, and there it is. Great. So quick and easy draft. Not really that complicated in terms of how this could work. The important part, of course, is the thread ID and the from message. If I don't have either one of those, what ends up happening is you do create a draft, but it just goes into your drafts, right? So it's not quite what you want. You want to actually have a draft that's going to be responded to somewhere, right? So I'm going to discard these ones, and I'm going to go ahead and archive that one, and we'll send one more message to ourselves and another one. Okay, so oftentimes though, what you might want to do is have a little bit more control over how these come in. In that case, you would go to my little blog post I created on justautomate.co/Gmail and look for this send email draft reply. And you're going to want to download this workflow file. Now, if you don't want to download the workflow file, that's totally okay. I'm just going to go ahead and download this one, and I'm going to override the one that I have on there. But the idea here is there's configuration that will go step by step to make this happen. But a big part of it is using code blocks and actually encoding and creating our own reply here. So going back into N8n, this works okay. This actually works, I think, pretty well overall, but you might want to actually take a look at how to do yet another approach. So to do this, we're going to import from file, and I'm going to import from my desktop where I just saved that one, and I'll go ahead and open this up, and here we go. So the idea here is now I'm only using the Gmail trigger, and then I'm using things otherwise. So the reason you might do something like this is if you are going to be mixing and matching your Gmail trigger. Another reason might be if you want to use AI in the mix somewhere in here to send your drafts or to actually change it altogether. So it's kind of up to you on how you go about doing that. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete that one and just leave this create draft up here for you for later. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to jump into the Gmail trigger, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I have a test event. It looks like I got a message in there. It's the same. It's the same exact as what we've done before. And if you didn't notice, we just went ahead and imported a N8n template. It's a very straightforward process to do, and there's templates all over the place. Next up, what we've got is another way to use our actual API auth is I can call HTTP requests to Gmail itself. So if you actually take a look at the Gmail API docs and you paste in this URL here, you can actually see a bunch of information, a bunch of different data points that you can use with just what's called an HTTP request. That's what this is. So this node gives us a lot more flexibility if our node doesn't have what we want. So you can actually build out a full-on request to call any sort of API, like what we're doing here with this get my data, right? So the get my data, for example, the Gmail data, if I go into Gmail itself, the node, in here, I'm not even sure if there is something about getting my information, right? I don't see anything related to that. So this one's really nice because when I execute it, it will actually include my email address, which makes it a lot easier to move this around for other workflows and other Gmail accounts. You would just need to run it for the first time. It's quite a bit more reusable. And then of course we've got our compose message in here, which would then go off of our trigger. So if we were to execute this step, we see that we get a little snippet of the email, but it's not the whole email. So going back into the trigger itself, we want to get rid of this simplify here, and let's go ahead and run this one now. Now I get a lot more data that's coming in here, mostly the text or the HTML. So the text and HTML then I could quite literally use in a next step. So like this compose message here is really meant to be like a placeholder for what you might send to something like ChatGPT, where then you would grab maybe the HTML data or maybe the text data, and you would use it in here as well. So let's go ahead and say something like our const recent text data equals to that text, and then you would come in and maybe add it to the reply text, which I'll do just like that. And this is probably not going to look very good, but let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. I hit execute step, and then there it goes. It says I'll get back to you soon. Looks like that text data is not coming through. Let's go ahead and try that again. Oh, there it is right there. Okay, so the text data is actually coming through. This, of course, you could then send to OpenAI, ChatGPT, whatever, and get a better formatted response. That response would then be fed into a different version of prepared draft. This just turns it into an encoded message. It's just a lot more granular, and of course it's code that I'm providing to you that you can then just use and review right on here. Now I just showed you how to do a draft with the other one, so feel free to use that one in lieu of that. Actually both of these steps. But it's nice to see how we can decouple these, especially if you decide that you're not going to be using Gmail in the future, or you're going to be using a different service. You still might have some of these steps in there. In other words, you would probably have something very similar to this. Maybe you would have an API call to actually send your draft, or maybe you would have the SMTP call. Either way, it would be okay. It would end up working just fine. And so there we go. That's how we can then send a draft message into here as well, using maybe a little bit more of the automation steps available to us, and also any sort of third-party workflow. So an important thing that we've learned here is now how to create those drafts, have them go right in line with the thread in Gmail in particular. These drafts should also reply to other messages as well. It's not like it's only Gmail. It's not going to only work for Gmail. But overall, this is actually a pretty straightforward way to make sure that all of that's working. But of course, it's worth testing with other places. And then at the same time, you can also come into any of your workflows, and now you can download them and then bring it in, and you could create a new workflow and then upload them. So basically importing from a URL, wherever you downloaded it from, and then you bring it back in, and there you go. So now all of that workflow is there. So the automation process is quite a bit easier. So Gmail, workflow, dupe. So both things I think are really, really critical to make sure that you get this right, or at least understand that you can download workflows and upload them. That's a really big unlock to learn how to use N8n far more. Let's now take some of our Gmail messages and insert them into a Google Sheet so you have an idea of how that works. So naturally, where it's going to start is adding a credential for our Google Sheets. So let's go ahead and do that inside of N8n and just do a quick search for Google Sheets OAuth API. We'll hit continue. They should look very familiar. Now the idea then is to jump it back into our Google Cloud, go into API and services, because we need to activate Google Sheets. So into the library one, we're going to look for the Sheets API. This is going to be this one right here. Go ahead and enable it. As you may know, Google Sheets works inside of Google Drive, so we will probably need that one as well, at least enabled. So we'll go ahead and do that with the Drive API as a search, and then we'll go ahead and enable that one as well. Now again, we have complete control over this. This is all ours. And so now what we could do is we can add in credentials. These should look exactly like the other ones that we did with Gmail, but of course they are different. So what's the question? How do we answer this one? Well, first off, we need to go to the OAuth consent screen, and we need to add in a client, or at least the credentials for it. So naturally, I could use the Gmail ones that we just created. I could actually add new, credentials for it, or I could just create a brand new client here, go into my web application. This one is going to be my N8n Workflows Sheets client, something like that. And then I add in the URLs like we saw before. I'll go ahead and copy the redirect URL here, bring it into my redirect here. The authorized JavaScript origins, I probably don't need that one, but I'll go ahead and add that one as well, which of course is my subdomain and my domain name without that trailing slash. We go ahead and create this. This of course gives me a new client ID, which I can bring in here. And then it also gives me a new client secret, which I can bring in here. Then I can go ahead and save that. And then of course I can go ahead and log in with Google once again. Now, actually, before I finish that, what I do want to have is I want to jump back in to my data access here, and I'm going to go ahead and add some scopes in here. So I want to do the Sheets API, do a quick search for that. It doesn't look like I have anything here. So once I type out Sheets, I can go ahead and grab all of the different Google Sheets API stuff in here if I don't already have them. It looks like I already put them in on my testing video. But the point is, you want to make sure you've got those ones in, and then you want the Google Drive API sheets as well. This is a few of them, so make sure you add all of those in also so that you have access to what you need. Okay, so the point is we've got our spreadsheet ones in here, and any other restricted scope we might have to review. And of course, you could always review these things in terms of the docs that are available. Okay, so let's go ahead and make sure I save everything, of course, with my scopes. Otherwise, it might not actually request them from me. And then I'll go ahead and sign in. Grab my user, and then I'll hit continue. And now it wants to do all of these different things. Again, I own this, totally fine. Let's go ahead and do that. Hit save and continue. And there we go. Okay, so at this point, I should be able to create a sheet directly with a workflow. So let's go ahead and create a workflow here, and I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new one, and it's going to be Google Sheets workflow. And I'll make it where it triggers manually. And the first thing that I'll do is go into my sheets, and then I'm going to go ahead and create a spreadsheet here. This is the process. We've got our connection string already. We're going to go ahead and create a document. We're not using a sheet within a document right now. Operation create, and we'll go ahead and say my Gmail messages as the new title here. And I'm going to go ahead and add a sheet name as well, just called messages. We'll execute this step. I should only have to do this one time, because then if I go into my Google Drive and refresh, I should be able to see that thing, and then I should be able to see the actual sheet itself with basically nothing in here. Great. So if it did that, then we're in a good spot to also remove that create spreadsheet, because I don't need to keep creating it. Once it's created, we're ready to go. The next part would be actually getting the messages. So let's go back into Gmail here, and then I'm going to go ahead and do get, let's try that again, Gmail, and then we will get our messages and get a message, get many messages. There we go. And I'm going to, instead of being simplified, I'm going to do something else. I'll go ahead and execute this step. This might take a bit of time because it does get 50 recent messages, which is maybe what you want to do. Let's go ahead and just do 5 just to make this like nice and easy on us. So 5 messages in here. And this, of course, is going to be executed here. Then I'm going to go ahead and grab it, and then I'm going to insert these messages into a sheet. So we'll go into Google Sheets here. Then I'm going to go ahead and do something called append or update row in a sheet. You could do append row as well, but we're going to do append or update. And I'll show you why in a moment. Next up is going to be our document. We just need to refresh this list here, go into the dropdown, and ideally you should see my Gmail messages. In my case, I've got other ones in there because I did some tests, and I'm going to go ahead and collect that my Gmail messages, and then I'm going to go into the sheet itself, and then I'm going to go ahead and map automatically as the first go. As soon as I execute this, it may or may not work as intended, but one thing it will do for sure is get the headers in here. So all of these headers, these rows in here, I could do it manually, or I could just do it automatically like I just did. Okay, I'm going to delete all that data. You could come in here and you could freeze this row too. I think up here, freeze up to row 1, so that when you're scrolling, it will show those headers still in there. Now, you could do all sorts of things with Google Sheets itself, which I'm not going to cover right now. But the idea is now we go back into this append or update row. This time it's no longer going to be mapping automatically, but manually. And now it does have a header, so we can actually map it according to what we want. So in this case, the only things that I really want are the ID and the thread ID. I don't think I need anything else in terms of those few ones up there. I definitely don't need the headers. Text, let's go ahead and break this one down. What's the text? Oh yeah, it's the raw email text. Sure, I want that one. And then maybe the text as HTML. Sure, I want that one. The subject, also great. References, maybe I need that, maybe not. I'm gonna just go ahead and say not. I'll bring the date in, who it's sent to, like who it was actually emailed to. That might be something that's interesting as well. Yeah, so maybe I want to do a filter in the future where it's only messages that are coming to me, because these ones are also my send messages. So, that's one thing. But in terms of the to and from, I'll just go ahead and put that email address in there on both of them. And it looks like we had an issue with that one. Let's see what's going on here. Let me grab that again. So we got expression in here, just drag that one over. And yeah, it's not liking that one, so I'm gonna go ahead and just delete it. Okay, I will also delete from and all of these other things, with maybe the exception of HTML. Really, it's like is HTML, but we'll go ahead and leave that. I execute this step now, and we've got a problem on the match on. Oh yeah, I didn't do the top two, so let's go ahead and bring those ones over. I'll explain this match on in just a moment. Let's go ahead and run it, and it's got a few in there. So if I jump into my messages now, I can see that there's like 5 in here. The first row is 1, and then it goes to 6, so there's 5 in there. If I were to run this again, and again, and again, it doesn't keep adding to this. That's because it's matching on the actual ID. So it's going to this ID and then putting the data in there. It will either update that data or basically do nothing. Or it'll add it if that ID or that message does not exist. So if I move this to like 10 messages, and let's go ahead and filter this one. So let's say, for instance, labels, and we grab the inbox, right? Execute. This is going to be different messages, of course. But now we go back into our messages, and maybe it changed, maybe it didn't. In this case, it didn't change. It didn't do anything. So we now have a way to, bring our messages into Google Sheets. How do we do the opposite? The opposite is actually what we would want to do on a different thread or a different workflow line. So the way we do this is going to be our sheets. We're going to bring this in here. We're going to go ahead and get rows in a sheet. And of course, it's that same sheet that we've been working off. And then the list is going to come from our messages right here. And of course, you can have some filters in there as well. Now, the key thing here is I don't want it on this path. The reason I don't is because this get many messages could be a lot more than 10, right? So if I get rid of the label filter in here, it is a lot more than 10, right? In which case it will execute this a lot more than 10 times, which we don't need. We only need this to run one time. So when I execute this now, I should be able to see these things. And then naturally what I could do from here is I can go back into Gmail, and then I can get the message itself from that message ID. So let's go ahead and grab that message ID in here now, go ahead and execute that. And then in theory, we will get the correct message itself. It looks like it's still looping through because it's getting a bunch of rows in here. So it's actually going through that, in which case we might want to add in a filter here. So let's go ahead and filter it down. I'm going to go ahead and grab this row number and set it equal to 2. Let's see if that works. I got an error here, so it doesn't look like it's wanting to work. Let's go ahead and say is equal to 2. There we go. So now we get one row in there. So then this get message here, now that we have that filter there, it should only show us this one thing. Granted, I can loop through things and I can do a bunch of other stuff that we've already talked about. But from here, I can now do that same process before, which was creating a draft and all that. So not only am I updating my sheets every time I run this workflow, but I'm also going to go back down and run the get rows and sheets. So naturally I could, do a loop in here. And most important of all is if I wanted to send back a message, I could do so in the row itself. So let's say, for instance, I came into my messages in here and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and add in my response. Let's go ahead and just bring it in as camel case. So there's no spaces in there and it fits with the other ones. Let's go ahead and do the very first one here and say my response is this, something like that. Let's go back into N8n. I want to go into my get rows here and I want to make sure that this is refreshed and I can execute that. And I should be able to see at the very end my response. Now I'm going to go ahead and filter this down and filter that my response exists. Let's execute that one. Now it is one again. So I don't actually need this one here now, but I can go ahead and run that. And then I can have another column in here, of course, that's saying like did respond or something along those lines. So we get this message here. Then I can go ahead and let's go ahead and just grab maybe our code block just so I can see that last filter and then my response here. So const my response equals to this value here. That's a constant. And then we would return back something along the lines of, response. And just like that, let's make sure this says return correctly. We execute this, and then now I could feed that back into all of the things I was doing prior with our drafts and all of that. And then now it's based in spreadsheets. You could, of course, think of this in terms of maybe a SQL database as well. But this gives us a lot more power in our workflows. Using those spreadsheets is huge. It's a big deal. Not just to mention for Google and Gmail and stuff like that, but all other things. Like if you wanted to share data with members of your team, you could automate it in here and then just share the data like you would with any sheet anyway. Really, really cool. This is like one of my favorite kinds of things to do in workflows is to use those sheets, which is why I wanted to show you. But of course, we can make these things a lot more powerful, and that's where I'm going to leave it with you. At this point, I hope that you can see the value that N8n brings to workflow automations. Now, we've only scratched the surface of what you could possibly do. So of course, I would encourage you to play around with other kinds of tools and maybe do something like taking an email message and sending it into Slack. That might be an interesting thing to do because it uses a lot of the same sort of techniques that we've done. But of course, I'm not showing you just yet. One of the things that I would do if I had no idea how to do it would be to look up templates for N8n and just work off of that. Now, having a self-hosted version of N8n means that we can have a ton of workflows running and we can know that they will continue to run up to the limits of what our server can do. And we have a pretty powerful server, so we probably won't ever really hit those limits. But if we do, we will see the value in upgrading to a new server to really power our N8n workflows. Now, the other part about this is the fact that we have a lot more control that we haven't touched yet. There's a lot of things that we can do on the server for N8n to make sure that we can run things like Python or install Node.js packages or NPM packages. So we just have a lot more that we can do in any given workflow. Now in this next part, I'm going to show you how to customize it and use some of those tools a little bit. The reason I say a little bit is because the flexibility that N8n provides, as well as the flexibility of software, could mean that that section could be its own course or many different courses, just learning about all of the nitty-gritty of the things that you can do. Now that part is going to be a lot more technical, so I'm going to assume that you know things like Docker and SSH. Even if you don't really know those things, I will still show you how it's done, how you can actually execute them, because it's a fairly straightforward process. But the idea here is to upgrade what we've done so far in our self-hosted instance to yet another level so we can really unlock the capabilities of programming mixed with N8n and the automation workflows. I'm really excited. Let's keep going. Let's go over some customizations we can do to our self-hosted N8n instance that's running on Hostinger. Of course, if you don't already have an account, assuming you skipped the part where I set it up, make sure you go to hostinger.com/cfe10, choose your plan. I would say grab as big of a server you are comfortable with. The bigger, the better, mostly because then you just have that much more power that you can work with these customizations for a long time to come. Anyways, I'm gonna go with KMV2. Of course, if you've already seen this part, just jump ahead a few moments. I'm not gonna go through too much other than you wanna go ahead and do the N8n one. And of course, make sure you go ahead and use the CFE10 coupon code when you go through that process. Once you actually finish setting it up, you will see something like this. Okay, so the idea here is we need to SSH into this virtual private server. We're gonna log in the server mostly so that we can actually customize what we're doing with N8n. In my case, I also have a custom domain name. I'm gonna show you where you put this, but the idea is, of course, with domain names, you're gonna be pointing your CNAME to the IP address that's in your VPS. That's the way you're gonna do it. Of course, that's how it works for all of them. But the idea now is we want to use SSH. If you've never used SSH, go ahead and do a quick search for Coding for Entrepreneurs and then do SSH blog post, something like that. And then you will see a bunch of different blog post items here. But this will show you how to set up your SSH keys if you don't know already how to do that. Anyways, let's go ahead and actually set this process up. I'm going to log in to root access on my host here. Now, the way I'm going to do it actually is through Cursor, but more importantly through the remote window. Now, the idea here, of course, for those of you who haven't done this before, is using something like Cursor gives me the AI tools in SSH sections as well. Now, of course, if you don't see that remote host, you might have to go into the extensions and look for SSH remote and just make sure that that thing's installed. I kind of feel like this is just something that ends up working. I feel like, newer versions of VS Code just have the remote host thing. Like I don't even have the other one installed, so it should work for you as well. Let's go ahead and jump into the SSH. Oh yeah, so now it's showing me that it's installing it. And then of course we want to add in a new host here, which you could do right in here. Let's go ahead and just use Cursor here and say, I want a new host for, and then I'll go ahead and grab those credentials and hit enter. Of course, using AI to write out your configuration is always a good idea in my opinion. But of course, this is taking too long in many ways, but go ahead and do that. There we go. So now we've got it, and I'll call this my N8n Hostinger, something like that. and I'll get rid of the port. I don't need to worry about that. I'll just have the username in there. And of course you could install all your SSH keys and whatnot as well. But I'm gonna go ahead and save that config, and let's go ahead and see if I can connect to it now. This of course is gonna open it up, and what we will need to do is add in our password. Now, if you're new to SSH and you are technical, what have you been doing? But also if you're new to SSH and you're not technical, this is just logging into that server and using our own code text editor to do so. It just makes it a little bit easier for us to modify things. Feel free to use the terminal window if you like, where you SSH in and do all that right in there. But it's a lot harder to actually edit code and stuff like that in a terminal window. If you're using something like VS Code, not only is it easier to edit code in general, but you also can just open up your chat tab and make changes from there, which I think is huge. Okay, so the idea now is we're gonna open up this folder here into root, and I'm gonna go ahead and say okay. And of course, now what we're gonna be doing, I might have to put my password in again. Installing those SSH keys is probably a good idea at this point, but I'm gonna leave it out. I'll leave that chat out for a moment, and then I see my Docker Compose in here. You can install extra extensions and stuff like that as you'd like, but the main thing as to what we're gonna be doing is customizing our N8n image. That's it. That's what we're gonna be doing right now. Right out of the gates, I'm just gonna go ahead and give you a Dockerfile here, and I'm gonna just call it dockerfile.n8n, and we'll go ahead and paste in some code here just to show you how simple this is. Now, if you haven't used Docker before, this is not gonna be simple at all. Of course, if you have, then it will be. The idea is we get the base image from N8n, we switch to our root user to install packages, we run through the installation, mostly adding in Python 3 and Python 3 dev and a few other dependencies you might need in here. Feel free to add more if you need to. Then we are also going to create a Python virtual environment. Now, of course, this is so you can install Python packages. So any sort of Python package you could put right here, and then it will be available for you in other places. So let's say, for instance, you wanted to add in something like LangChain in here, you could do that, right? This will give you the AI stuff that you might want to do in purely Python, or you could do Python requests. Now, the other thing, of course, of this Dockerfile is you could actually do it in all other places. You don't actually have to do it here at all. Like, you can actually store your Docker image somewhere else, build it, store it, do all of those things, and be able to swap it out at any time. But of course, this is one of the baseline ones that I found pretty useful in case of the actual Docker Compose file, and also what we end up doing with our Docker image. And that's kind of it. Okay, so next up is, of course, our Docker Compose file in here. If I scroll on down into the N8n service here, I can actually change the image. So I'm going to go ahead and comment it out. Right away, cursor already knows, hey, you want to change it to the dockerfile.n8n. Go ahead and do that. Now what we want to do is we want to take down Docker itself. So we do Docker Compose, and then we want to bring it down, so we run down. Now, if you're not familiar with Docker, of course, it would be very, very helpful to learn Docker commands. Now, if I see what's running, I can see there's N8n right here. This is exactly what I'm building off of. There's the default image. Of course, that's what we're using up here. So it already is working off of that one. And then there's this traffic service. This is how like all the routing ends up working and all that. So you probably don't want to change anything inside of traffic. You probably just want to leave that service as is, because it does all of the security keys and all that. And also in .env, this is something I actually changed inside of Hostinger before. So there's a way to change it in Hostinger directly. But of course, if you're a little bit more technical and you want your own subdomain and domain name, you would change these things. You can also change your time zone and all that, as well as your email. There's a lot of environment variables you can actually change. And going back into Docker Compose itself, what we end up seeing is it's not actually loading those environment variables right in here. So it actually works a little bit different. I'm not fully sure how it loads those environment variables. It's probably something that happens on the server side that loads them, but feel free to load them in here as you see fit. I actually think a lot of those environment variables are more associated to what's going on with traffic than anything. But anyways, you can change your domain name and subdomains right in here. At this point, let's go ahead and actually build our new one. So I'll go ahead and do Docker Compose down, and I'm gonna then run Docker Compose. Well, actually, let's just verify that it's down by going into our web application. It's down, it's not up and running at all. All I need to do to use that one is, of course, save my Docker Compose file in here with that Docker file that's in there. And then I do Docker Compose up. You want to get in the habit of building it, especially if you are changing it. So another thing to do is just do Docker Compose build. That would be a way to ensure that you are building it. Now, one of the warnings it gave you is that this version is like no longer something you need in there. So you can get rid of that as well, because Docker Compose has changed a little bit since older versions of Docker Compose, basically. But the idea is it's obviously going to build out our Docker image, and you can see it's building out Python 3.12. It's running all of the different installations in here that are necessary in order for this thing to work. That's great. That's now working in there. The other part that's really important about what we do in this Dockerfile is we actually add the Python path directly in there, the virtual environment Python path. This will come into play in just a moment. So now that's built, I'm going to go ahead and do Docker Compose up. I don't need the -- build right now, but it is a nice one. So I'll just do -d to run it in the background. This, of course, might prompt some things from cursor, but the idea is, of course, now it is running in the background. So if I refresh in here, it might take a moment for it to be fully up and running, but once it is, it's back to what it was, right? So I didn't lose any data. And actually, if you do Docker Compose and down and then remove the volumes, that will still or should still keep your volume or your actual data in here because of how the volumes are managed. So all of the data in N8n is treated as external. So this N8n data here actually gets stored in the user for N8n on the virtual private server, which I think is great because if you accidentally were to try and remove the volumes, that one doesn't remove until you manually do it, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, so to that end, let's go ahead and actually try something out. I'm gonna go ahead and do a create workflow here, and then I will just go ahead and trigger it manually, and then we're gonna go ahead and look for execute command. In this command, all I really want to do is Python 3 -- version. You probably can do Python version as well, but if I execute this, it should give me an out. And if I do Python -- version, same thing. Run that, also an out. I can also do which Python, same thing, run that, and there you go. So we got a lot of cool stuff with this one in terms of actually running through different Python commands. Now, of course, if you were using the old version, then it wouldn't do that. And of course, I can prove that to you pretty quickly. So let me just prove it to you by switching back to the old version, not our Dockerfile, with Docker Compose down. Just bring it on down, and then we will go ahead and bring it on up once traffic is there. Okay, and there we go. And jumping back in, I'll refresh on that same workflow. Might take a moment for it to be ready for me, but I'll refresh a few times. My session is still active. There's a lot of really good things about what we just did, which I think is cool. Now, if I go to run the Python 3, it can't find it because, of course, the actual Docker image itself isn't available. Now, this is kind of strange because there is this thing inside of using N8n called code, and it says code in Python. So I'm not exactly sure what this does, if it even works really. I don't actually use that one pretty much ever. I use this route instead. I think doing the inline code block works really well for a bunch of different things, but in many cases you might want to run your own code, in which case I'll show you how to do that next. It's very straightforward. While we level up our N8n instance with Python stuff, it's important to understand that this manual process of using SSH is not going to be the best in the long run. In the short run, while you're learning to make these things work, totally fine. In the long run, you're probably going to want to change it just a little bit. Okay, so one of the things that I did inside of this Dockerfile is I created this directory called PyScripts. And of course, I don't actually have anything in there just yet, but let's go ahead and verify that. First off, we do our Docker Compose build. If I need to build it again, then I will. And of course, if it did build again, then you're going to want to bring it down, run this remove orphans every once in a while. That will become more clear later. But the idea is you want to make sure that the Docker file is all built and ready to go before you enter into the Docker container itself. So this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to look at the Docker container before we start modifying it. Okay, so I have the container running, which I can verify with Docker Compose and PS. This shows me the two different services that are running, the image names themselves, the commands that they're running with, and then of course the service name. So the service name is defined inside of Docker Compose, and you can see it right there. So how we can enter this running container is by using Docker Compose. We can actually do execute N8n, and then a lot of times you'll think like something like bin/bash. This is my intuition would be to bin/bash, and then you see there's no process. You can't do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and try bin/sh and see if that works, and it does. So this is actually really nice. And the other thing about this that was not intuitive to me is I didn't have to do the interactive terminal flag for those of you who know Docker Compose really well. But the point here is we are now inside of our Docker container. So we're actually 3 levels in. So if you like Inception, the first level would be on your local computer. 1 level deeper is the SSH to our VPS. 1 level deeper is from our SSH in our VPS is now our Docker container. And that's where we are. So we are 3 levels deep. And all we see in here if I run ls is PyScripts. If I navigate into PyScripts here, I can see there's nothing in here. So Python itself, though, should be in here, and it should work just fine. So the real question is, how do we actually bring in these scripts from maybe our local server into here? Naturally, we would probably want to use Git at some point as well. You could do this inside of a Docker container as well as your SSH session. I'll leave that up to you on the approach you want to take. I would recommend having your actual virtual private server, grab those files, and then you build your Docker image itself. But what I want to do here is I actually want to update the PyScripts. So I exited out of level 3 and now I'm back at level 2 just in my SSH session. And we can verify this by listing things out. We've got a couple more items in here. Granted, all these dot files are also showing up as well, which you can see with ls-al. Okay, so the idea now is how do we actually modify the Docker Compose file to have our own PyScripts? Now, before I actually write out the volume that we want, which is what it comes down to inside of N8n, you're going to bring in your own custom volume here. The important part is I actually make the directory we want it to go to, and I change the ownership to the correct user. So this directory was very deliberate because the user we'll end up with is the node user. When we actually build it out, we use the root user. So you don't really want the root user at runtime, which of course is what this Dockerfile is all about. But this package or this destination right here is going to be true for all of us. And so when you go into Docker Compose, you do :/ so we know what the destination is. The question is then, is at level 2 in our SSH, where do we actually put this code? Well, I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called PyScripts. And then I'm going to go ahead and inside of here, I'll just go ahead and do hello world.py. And inside of there, I'll go ahead and print out, hello world. Save that. And then we'll go back into our Docker Compose, which means that I can actually use this relative to Docker Compose.yaml folder, and I can bring that in. And so when it comes to Docker Compose and volumes, a lot of times it can be really tricky, but most of the time if you see a dot in front of something, it's likely going to be stored on that local machine. This also might be true for a /. So if I do a list out of that / of those local files, I'm not really seeing anything in here, but it's certainly possible that I just haven't made anything just yet. So if you really want to test if it's working, you could just do echo and ABC123 into the local files one, right? So local-files/hello.txt. In other words, this should give you, oops, I need to do the echo correctly with a quote at the end of it as well. And then this hopefully will give us a file in there. And of course, now if I list out the local files, hopefully I'll see that. Okay, great. So the idea here then is we have a couple volumes on our SSH machine, our virtual server level 2, that are going to go now into level 3 because of this definition right here. So going back into the volumes, if you see a path, there's a really good chance that it's on whatever level is making that path, and it's going to go in one more level into the container with these colons here. Whereas these volumes work a little bit differently that are declared in there. Okay, so that might confuse you more than it did than anything, but hopefully it helped a little bit. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and bring down these the service itself. Don't do -v, you don't need to do that. So I'll bring down the Docker Compose service, and then we'll bring it right back up. There we go, and let's go ahead and do that. Put it in background mode, And then once again, we'll go ahead and do Docker compose. You can always do run N8n and then sh as well. This will create a new container for that service, which is why you saw me get rid of orphans before. When you do these new containers, sometimes it does these permissions where you might need to change users and stuff like that. So when this happens, that's where you just go ahead and do Docker compose execute N8n sh. So the actual server's already running with all the configuration it needs in order for you to get into the sh shell. Now that we've got this, let's go ahead and list things out. We see PyScripts in there. If I navigate into PyScripts, I can see there's my hello world. So I should be able to run Python hello world.py and hit enter. Great. So there, of course, is the output from that print statement in here. What if I actually changed it like hello worlder and tried that again? Ooh, what do you know? It actually does change that file. That's because of the mounting volume. So if you're not familiar with volumes, this is really a Docker thing. If you're not familiar with this, it's kind of like a sync, if you will, from your level 2 to your level 3, your server to your Docker container. So it's sort of a sync. In your Dockerfile, you can actually copy those files too, where it's not a sync. So it's kind of up to you on how you go about doing it. But in this case, I think it's really nice. So then all I need to do is go into the server itself and change these PyScripts for the next most important part, which would be actually running this command inside of N8n. But before I do that, I just want to go ahead and list out what's inside of files and just verify there's that hello text. And I can do files and hello.txt. And there we go. So we have now 2 locations for this. The only reason that I've got this PyScripts in here was to really illustrate this purpose. You might stick with their defaults. You might not. It's going to be up to you on how you go about doing this. But of course, now I want to just see this inside of my container. So if I do docker compose ps, I should see my 2 things running there. And then I'll go ahead and jump into N8n again, and I'm going to execute a command. So the question here, of course, is what command are we going to execute? Well, it's going to have to be basically the path to the script. So that's going to be this right here. Let's try that again. And then whatever the script is. So it'd be hello world.py, execute that step, and then we've got hello world in here. Did we change it back to hello world? I think so. So hello world again, save it, make sure you do that, execute the step again. What do you know? There it is. So this is fantastic, right? So it makes it just a lot easier to be able to write any sort of Python code that you might want. That's the point here. Now, the other point of this, one of the key things would be to make sure that your requirements for whatever those PyScripts are is going to be available to you. So that's another thing you might want to consider doing with the copy command. So for example, if I came into PyScripts here and did requirements.txt, and I'm going to go ahead and bring in Python requests, for example, just a really simple one. Then back into my Dockerfile, I will need to do something like this, where we're going copy, and then we grab the relative path, copy relative path here, and that's going to be / relative path. Great. I'm going to put it into temporary, and then requirements.txt, so that then I can come down here and say actually we'll put another line there and do and then opt venv bin pip install -r requirements.txt, the location that it ends up being in. Okay, so that will allow for me to do that. And the easy way for all of this to work is to just go ahead and take down our Docker compose, or rather we can do Docker compose build and just see the results. And what you end up seeing is the copy works. And then at some point we should see on this one that it's going to install all of those different packages. So we've got pip, we've got psutil in here, and then the final one will be from requirements.txt, which should hopefully show us that it's installing requests, and it looks like it is. So now we've got that package in there as well, which of course just means that we need to bring down our Docker instances that are running, and I'll go ahead and remove orphans. And then I can go ahead and bring it back up just to have, that actual requirement now in there. So if you make a lot of changes to those requirements, you absolutely have to bring down the container and then rebuild it and do all that. Now, again, all of that stuff can be done automatically. You can make automated systems to do that, But as you're learning this process, especially if you're really new to everything that we've talked about, even if you know some things about Docker, I highly recommend doing it manually as long as you possibly can so that you can eventually get it right to where you're like, okay, now I know I can just run this stuff and we will be able to execute the steps as needed and all that. So that part's really cool. Now, the other thing is inside of your workbook that's going on here, or any sort of workflow that you're working through, you probably want to have a few other aspects to it that I think are important, and they're related to NPM and JavaScript. When it comes to using N8n with JavaScript, there's a few things that aren't activated by default. If you look for Node and let's say, for instance, the crypto package inside of Node.js, this is built into Node.js, and it's something that is a very powerful package for a lot of different things, which I'll show you in a moment. But the idea is, of course, going back into N8n, if you were to bring in a code block and come in here and just go ahead at the very top right, const crypto equals to require crypto, and try to run this, you will get cannot find module crypto. Okay, so in part it's because I spelled it incorrectly, but it's also in part because it's just not available for us to use. So this, of course, is a downside of the default that N8n has, but it's also a good security feature, right? So N8n was designed for a bunch of people who are non-technical to use this, or non-developers to use this in their workflows, and so they don't want to have a lot of potentially malicious code coming through. That's kind of the point, of course. But in our case, we have self-hosted versions of this that we can change as we see fit. So the idea here is we're going to come in and we're going to make some inline environment variables that I want to change. Now, the reason I'm doing them inline versus something like in Docker Compose only has to do with the fact that I pretty much always want these to be active so that I have control over them when I'm using any sort of block whatsoever. I don't need it to be turned on or off. The actual modules that you would use are directly inside of their configuration. So as far as N8n is concerned, they have got a lot of configuration that you can take a look at. One of them is the code module stuff. So you could quite literally copy all of these in here and bring them into your your Docker file that you end up using. Now, of course, you're not going to use export. You would use env instead. So you can replace all of these with env and just allow for these to just work. Okay. So the main one is allowing all of the built-ins. If you want to have like file system access or crypto, you would just allow all of them. And notice that there's 3 versions in here. I'm going to leave all of them in here. I'm also going to go ahead and grab the actual documentation and leave that in there as well, because it's pretty easy to forget these things. The external ones are about the NPM packages that you have available to you. So to run those, you would also basically put them up by maybe the Python one, and then you can go ahead and say, let's go ahead and configure npm node packages. And as you may note, I turned off cursor tab, which you can really easily re-enable, but you just run npm and then it automatically does it. Okay, so npm install global, and then I can add in, let's say, moment and Lodash and many other npm packages that you might want to use. Now, npm packages themselves might have other dependencies that cause all sorts of security issues, so of course be aware of that. This isn't any different than Python. Those both have that same sort of issue. If you install packages you don't trust, or most people don't, be aware there's a lot of security implications for that, which is exactly why N8n disables a bunch of these in there. But I'm going to go ahead and re-enable them. Now, naturally, I changed the Dockerfile, so I need to do Docker Compose build. I just, of course, want to make sure that the npm actually works. Now, every once in a while, you might need to upgrade npm like it does right here, and that's something you can do as well. Feel free to add maybe this one right here and do run npm upgrade and then and then we would do something along those lines where we bring that one in after. Completely up to you on whether or not you want to do that. npm is usually pretty fast, so I think rebuilding it is not that big of a deal. But of course, if the version changes or something like that, then you might want to change that version. A lot of times I like locking the version so I can change it as is. in particular for an NPM. Okay, so what we've got here is now a few different changes to our, our Dockerfile and the installations that we have. All I want to do is verify that the code in JavaScript can now work. And then I'll show you a quick little example as to it working. It's taking a little bit of time to build it, but let's go ahead and take a look at this example now. If I go to justautomate.co and then Clerk, the Clerk is a really great tool for authentication, for like managing users and stuff like that. But the main thing that I wanted to look at was, how do I verify a webhook that's coming in? And this verification process uses crypto. This is actually how I stumbled upon this feature altogether. And so this is actually a really practical use case to verify when a webhook's coming through. You want to do this on your webhooks. I'll show you what a webhook looks like in a moment, but the idea overall is you want to make sure that the webhook data that's coming through should be coming through. It's not just somebody has your endpoint and that ends up working. Looks like it didn't want to install npm, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that altogether, and we'll come back and rebuild it. That's okay. I don't need to worry about that right now. There's a lot of different things that we could worry about in terms of making that work better. But I'm going to go ahead and take everything down, and then we will go ahead and bring it back up. So when it comes to npm, if you needed to really update it, you might have to do a bunch of modifications to the Dockerfile to get the latest version, which also might cause issues with N8n itself. So yet another reason to maybe not update npm itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring it up, and then we'll jump into our workflow here. I'll reload it. I might have lost the code block in there because I don't know if I saved it or not. So I might have to bring that in, and it looks like I didn't. Okay, so when it comes to different trigger nodes, if you came in here and did workflow, or not workflow, but webhook, okay? So a webhook exposes a URL with a path, right? So that path is included there. And then a lot of times you'll have authentication in here, but sometimes you won't. And if you don't have authentication, you're definitely gonna wanna verify the source of this data. So a lot of times what happens then is you will get something like a code block in here, and this would be something like verify webhook data, and in which case this Clerk automation would make sense there. So you would come in and you would bring this one in here, which will be specific to Clerk. You add your Clerk webhook secret in here, and then you would come down and you would end up getting a bunch of other things in here as well. And of course, I'm not going to be able to execute this step because it needs previous data, which we just don't have. But the point is that the actual crypto part is now in there, which I'm going to go ahead and try out. Let's go ahead and turn this off. I'll go ahead and add in another code block in here for JavaScript, and here we go. And now I'll go ahead and at the very top of this one, let's go ahead and run that, and it's in there. Great. Let's go ahead and run that, and I get no error with crypto. Great. That's exactly what we wanted, of course. So the final thing is basically, how do we actually get environment variables inside of there as well? So this is where I want to test something out. So we've got this environment variable called node function allow external. Let's go into our code here, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to return back. We're going to go ahead and return back our that function, and it'll be process.env.node function external. So we're not getting the process in here. So this is probably because this is run through Node.js. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and grab this, and I'll go into cursor here. I'm going to go ahead and chat it up and say, how do I run inside a N8n code block? And this, of course, will give me that answer. I know some of you are a lot more advanced and are like, I already know how to run that itself, but hopefully what it'll do is it'll give me the code itself in order for it to work. And it looks like maybe it's still incorrect. So it's saying process not found. So let's go ahead and grab this one, this little warning here. And I'll go ahead and bring this in, get this warning. All right. And really, it's just about trying to get all of this stuff working correctly in terms of process. Let's see this one. Oh, this one says env. Let's try that. Okay, so let's just put $env. See if that one. Nope, cannot find name $env. And the other one is maybe just adding the node types. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. And we'll bring this into our installations. And I want to save this. And then let's go ahead and bring it down, or we can build it. Let's just make sure that even works in there. And it looks like we're good. And then let's go ahead and bring it up. I think it will recreate it for us. It looks like it is or did. So let's go ahead and now maybe refresh in here. Yeah, it looks like I need a refresh in there. And then we can actually go through this process. Let's see what's going on. Okay, so once again, I'm going to change this to process.env, and let's execute that step. And once again, it's not showing. So perhaps it's a downside of using JavaScript. That part we're not going to diagnose right now. If you find how to do it, feel free to let us know. But what I want to do is now, as command, execute a command. Let's go ahead and see if I can do echo $, that value. Let's go back in here and grab that environment variable here and run that step. And what do you know? There is that value. So it actually does set it. So what does that mean then? In our code here, we would then be able to grab that data and say something along the lines of const that equals to that data. And then I can go ahead and come in here. And now I've got the ability to use some environment variables. Great. Okay, so that probably isn't necessarily the best thing. I probably would rather have process.env, but there's probably something inside of N8n that's preventing that, which might be a good thing, or it might be just trying to push you towards upgrading to using their variables and stuff like that, which I wanted to avoid, which is exactly why we've got this env data here. And so, of course, the next thing to test would be whether or not this works. So let's say, for instance, my super secret, and you do ABC123, right? So we save that, and let's go ahead and see if this recreates it. Looks like it did. We've got my super secret in here, and this time I'll go ahead and use that as my output, and let's go ahead and run that, and there's my super secret. Cool. So naturally, this isn't great because it goes to std out, and it's not necessarily working the way you might want it to, but overall it is working in terms of the commands themselves. You also might consider using something like Python. Let's see if we can do that, where we do -c import os and then print os.environ.get, and we'll use a single quote here and then close that off, double quote. Let's see if I got the code correct. And look at Python code ends up grabbing it. So in other words, our Python scripts have access to the environment variables. No big surprise there if you are familiar with this process. So the real question then, of course, would be, well, how exactly should I be writing and running a bunch of custom code? I would say to avoid writing a bunch of custom code inside of here. I would say instead, you actually have specific functions that you want to be able to run to make sure that that happens. So if we run, let's say, for instance, npm in here, let's do npm -version, for example. I think we should be able to run this just fine. So let's go ahead and run that. Oops, I didn't do the correct one. So let's go ahead and try that again. The correct one being there it is, and then node --version. So just like what we did with Python, with these, you can do the same with Node. And you can do the same with pretty much any other programming language if you need it out there. So then this execute command would just run a function of some kind or some module that you have instead of always trying to do it in this code in JavaScript. Now, of course, every once in a while, you'll have other arguments that are part of the workflow where this makes a whole lot of sense. And then maybe you build out your own package that you then import in there that then has easy access to the environment variables on the system itself. So that's another thing to think about when it comes to working through some of these customizations. Okay, cool. So we can see how we can customize all sorts of things with N8n. Let's take a look at a practical use case where maybe you're wanting to get updates about your N8n system, the server itself, and you want those to come to you on a regular basis. So jumping into PyScripts here, I'm going to go ahead and do sysupdate.py, and then I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste a bunch of code. Now the reason I'm not just giving it to you or writing it out is because that would take a long time. But the idea here is it's going to give me all sorts of good information and it's going to be all printed out. Now I had this built with the help of AI, so you could do the same. I don't know if it's the best information necessarily, but it does give you comprehensive server information as to what's going on. Once we save that, it should be already available to us. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this relative path, and then I'll jump into my N8n. And now I'm going to go ahead and we can save this old one. And let's go ahead and create a new workflow here that's going to be a daily system status, something like that. So I'm going to have two ways to execute this, triggering manually, of course, and then also I'm going to go ahead and bring in a scheduler, and then we will go ahead and use this every day. Let's go ahead and do it at 5 a.m. Okay, great. So now we've got two in here. As soon as I've got that, I want to do the next part, which of course will be, let's go ahead and grab in execute command. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and use Python 3 and then that actual command itself, which of course is not just there, but it's home node/pyscripts. Again, we could probably put this in as a variable. It probably would be a good idea to have this in as a variable somewhere. But again, we can come in here and just verify that that is the root of that path. And so we would be able to, in theory, run this one. I'm going to execute the step, and if everything did correctly, we get the std out with all of this stuff. Great. So now I can bring in both of these things, and here we are. We've got our execute command, and let's go ahead and say get status update via Python or something like that. Then we're going to go ahead and go into our Gmail here, and I'll go ahead and send a message. Where do I want to send this message? There's a lot of different options, but I'll go ahead and do system update dash. I'm going to go ahead and bring it into an expression because there is this thing called variables and context that we can use all sorts of stuff in here. As you can see, vars is locked because you got to update, but I can still get now in there. And of course I could always call commands directly in, code and all that if I wanted to, but this system update, totally fine. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and save that for just a moment, but then what I might wanna do is go back in. Let's go ahead and save this for just a second. I'm gonna go back into this little workbook we did, where is the auto draft, where I got my Gmail data. I'm gonna go ahead and copy this block right here, copy it multiple times, bring it in here and paste it in. And of course, this is what you'll want to do on a regular basis. Copy and paste things, and then just go ahead and bring that in like that. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and bring this on down. I'm going to go ahead and edit some fields in here so that I can rename. Let's go ahead and execute some previous data here. So I can rename this to something different. Right now it's std out. Let's go ahead and say system and msg, and we'll go ahead and say rename output fields. Execute this step, and then there we go. And then we're going to go ahead and put this one there. And then send message now is going to take a few. Let's go ahead and run and get my Gmail data. If everything's done correctly, we've got it all there. Go back into send my message. Who are we sending it to? My Gmail data. Great. What are we sending? Well, it's going to be a text message here, and I'm going to be sending rename output fields to the system message. And then I'm going to go ahead and run this step in here. And sure enough, it should be sent. I'm going to add the option of getting rid of that attribution. Well, let's go ahead and send it again. Let's go ahead and check out Gmail, and naturally there is our system update right there. And the one that doesn't have the N8n stuff is in there as well. Pretty cool. So it shows me my Python version, how many computers I've got going, what's available, all sorts of good stuff. Now, naturally, what you could do with this one is also, since it's going to run every day, you could also see how much is left. So if you needed to start moving to a bigger server, you could totally do that. It's a really easy way to do a system check and have it sent to your email or anywhere else you'd like. And so to me, this is a very practical use case as to why you might even install Python in the first place, even for just that one thing. It doesn't need a whole lot, and there's probably another way to do it because it's all code. You're writing a bunch of automations. But to me, this is one of the simplest ways to do it, and you can do it in, 5 minutes? It doesn't really take that long. As long as you have your custom N8n going with your Python environment all set up, very straightforward process, very easy to do. So yeah, this is why we customize things and self-host. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this, and hopefully you start using N8n. I think it's a huge enabler for automations for people of all backgrounds. And realistically, it's bringing a lot of non-developers into the fold of automation, which I'm really excited about and I want to support. So if there's an automation that I didn't cover, which is of course a lot of them, please let me know in the comments. I want to actually try out new and different automations and see how we can be clever about this, because I think what automations do is they open up a lot more attention and time for us to do and use our creative brains, which of course we all have. Even if you don't think that you have it, this is how we were made. We are creative individuals and we can come up with all sorts of really interesting, cool ideas, and I think automation will get us there. Now you'll also notice I touched nothing with AI really in this one in terms of the automations. I think the automations are a precursor to start building them into AI agents, or even just using AI inside of a workflow to like maybe make better messages or something like that. I do think we're on that trajectory. It'll just be a matter of time when we see it. And of course, thanks to Hostinger for helping bring this course to life. Without them, this course literally would not be here. I was not planning on doing this just yet, but they came up with this really cool idea. So I went ahead and said, yeah, let's go ahead and build out some automations with N8n and of course self-hosting, which allowed for me to dive a lot deeper into this subject and bring what you see now to you. So thanks again to Hostinger for helping bring this one to life. I'm really excited to see what we can do more in the future. So thanks again for watching, and let me know if you have automations that you want me to check out. You can put them in the comments below. You can send them to me on X. Either way, thanks again. I'll see you next time.